Today's story is about a man and his quest for the perfect photo. He would eventually get it, but it would cost him dearly. We will show you his picture at the end of today's video. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to buy the like button a brand new set of AirPods, but just give them regular earbuds with the cords cut off. Also, please subscribe. Saturday, April 25th, 1987 was a beautiful spring day in the mountains of northwest Montana. It was exactly the kind of day that 40-year-old Charles Gibbs and his wife Glenda had been waiting for months. The sky was clear, the sun was bright, and the breeze was warm. And so, at around 9 a.m. that morning, Charles and Glenda had a quick breakfast inside of their house in the rural city of Libby, and then they started stuffing their backpacks full of their hiking equipment. Charles and Glenda were going to go to Glacier National Park, which is a 1 million acre wilderness preserve with alpine meadows, forests, rivers, and lakes that are so bright and crystal blue, they almost look like they're glowing. The park is ringed by snow-covered mountains, and it's dotted with glaciers, which are huge masses of pure ice that jut up out of the rock and make you feel like you've stumbled onto some ancient frozen planet. The park is actually so otherworldly that when Hollywood producers were looking for a location to shoot the heaven scene in the big movie What Dreams May Come, they chose Glacier National Park as their location. And for Charles and Glenda, this place practically was heaven. It was the place they went all the time to go hiking, especially on beautiful sunny spring days. After packing all of their gear, Charles and Glenda made their way out the front door and began heading to their car, when as they were walking, Charles suddenly stopped short, shook his head, turned around, and ran back inside the house. When he came back out again, he was carrying his camera bag, and so he ran over to the car, he sat down in the driver's seat, and he grinned at his wife, and he held up the bag, and he said, "Now we're ready." Both Charles and Glenda worked for the public schools in Libby. Glenda was an elementary school teacher, and Charles drove a school bus. But like a lot of people who lived in Montana, their real passion was the outdoors. And for Charles specifically, his real passion was wildlife photography. He was actually a pretty accomplished amateur photographer. He'd had a couple of photo exhibits locally, and he'd gotten a few of his pictures published in the local newspaper. But what Charles really wanted to do with his photography was get one of his wildlife pictures published in a weekly publication called the Hungry Horse News. The Hungry Horse News was a tiny publication, but they had won a Pulitzer Prize, which is the highest award for American journalism. And the Hungry Horse News was famous for its nature photography. Charles had been submitting his work for years to the Hungry Horse News, but the editor kept rejecting them, telling Charles that his photos were totally beautiful, but they weren't dynamic enough. Nothing was happening in these photos. And so that morning, on the couple's drive to Glacier National Park, Charles began talking out loud to Glenda about what strategy he was going to use for his photographs during their hike. You know, what route they were going to be on and what was the best angle to take certain pictures. And as Glenda listened to Charles, she just smiled to herself because it was like no matter how many times Charles got shot down by the Hungry Horse News, she knew he was never going to give up. And so she loved his determination and just unflappable attitude about his craft. At around 11 a.m., Charles and Glenda pulled off the highway and began heading towards the trailhead where they would start their hike that day, which was located at the base of Elk Mountain on the southern border of the park. The route they had chosen for that day was not one of the most popular at the park, and the reason for that was the trail was really steep, and in certain parts of it was fairly overgrown, and so really only the most hardcore hikers would go up this trail, of which there weren't that many. And so Charles and Glenda were used to being on this trail and seeing no one. But they preferred it that way. They loved being alone out in nature. Finally, they reached the gravel parking lot right at the trailhead, and Charles parked their car, and then he and Glenda hopped out. They grabbed their bags and then began walking on this trail. The first mile of this trail brought the couple out along an abandoned road and then over some railroad tracks and then out into this beautiful field full of white flowers. And then the trail really started to get difficult because it basically went straight up the side of a mountain. And as they walked up this really steep part of the trail, Charles was nonstop taking pictures of everything he saw. There were deer and mountain goats, and at some point the couple reached a clearing on this steep section where they could look down and see a lake, and they saw there were beavers hard at work building a dam. And so of course, Charles got a picture of that too. Now, these were the days before digital photography, and so all these pictures that Charles was taking, he couldn't actually see. He needed to go home and develop the film to see if anything he took was worth keeping. But as Charles and Glenda continued their hike up this mountain, Charles was getting more and more excited about some of the shots he was getting. He felt like they were going to be really, really good, and Hungry Horse News was going to finally accept his work. The couple made it to the summit of this trail by early afternoon, and from up there, they had this beautiful panoramic view of all these jagged mountaintops that were covered in snow, separated by these huge valleys and prairies, and Charles and Glenda were the only ones up there, and so they had this unbelievable view all to themselves. And so the couple would eat the lunch that they brought with them while sitting on this rocky outcropping, kind of looking out over this stunning view. And then when they were done, they packed up their stuff and began heading back down because they knew they wanted to get off of this trail and out of the park before sundown. It was just about 5 p.m. when Charles and Glenda had reached the final slope of this steep section of the trail, and they were getting closer and closer to that big open field with the white flowers. And as they're going down this last section of steepness, Charles suddenly grabs Glenda and stops her and puts his fingers to his lips and then turns around and points behind him. Charles was visibly excited about whatever he was pointing at, but when Glenda looked in the direction he was pointing, she couldn't see anything, but she obviously knew that whatever he was pointing at, Charles wanted to take a picture of it. Now, Glenda by this point was really tired from the hiking and just wanted to go back to the car and go home. I mean, after all, Charles had taken dozens and dozens of pictures that day, like we don't need to get one more. And so Glenda would look at Charles impatiently, basically suggesting like, come on, we can come back another time. But Charles didn't budge, and he looked at her like, please, I want to get one more photo. And so Glenda kind of did one of these and was like, okay. And Charles said, thank you, I'll meet you at the car. And so Glenda stood there and watched as her husband got his camera out, turned around, and began slowly making his way back up the trail. And again, Glenda's looking. She can't see what he's going to take a picture of, but she figured, he had his plan. And Glenda, she turned around and began heading back down towards the car. It didn't take long for Glenda to get back to the car. She got there right around 6 p.m. And when she got there, she hopped inside, sat in the front passenger seat, turned on the radio, and then she expected to have to wait for maybe another 20 minutes or so for Charles to finish up and come join her. But Glenda, after sitting in the car, was so tired that she accidentally fell asleep. And when she woke up again, she was kind of disoriented, and immediately she looked to see if her husband was in the car with her, and he wasn't. And she's looking outside, it's getting pretty dark out. She glanced at her watch, it was 7 p.m., which means Charles had left her for at least an hour by this point. And she's thinking, there's no way Charles would have been gone for an hour. He would never do that. He would never leave me alone like that. And so Glenda began glancing around her, kind of half expecting to see Charles just outside of their car, doing something, but she was all alone. There was no other hikers or cars. Charles wasn't there. And so starting to panic, Glenda got out of her car and began hustling back onto the trail to go look for Charles. And so she's yelling for Charles, she's looking around, it's getting darker and darker, and there's no sign of Charles. He's not calling back to her, it's just totally silent. She walks along the abandoned road, she reaches the railroad tracks, she gets into that meadow with the white flowers, and still there's no sign of Charles. And she gets to the base of that steep section of the trail, and she's looking up at all these trees and how dark it was getting, and she's thinking to herself, if Charles is in trouble somewhere up there, there's no way I can help him by myself in the dark with no equipment. No one knows I'm here. I mean, this is an emergency and I need help. And so Glenda would scream a few more times for Charles. And after not hearing any response, she turned and ran all the way back to her car. She turned it on and she drove to the nearest ranger station. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. When I was younger, there were several people I was very close with who struggled mightily with depression, and it was very difficult to watch because all I wanted to do was help them, but the reality is it's the person who is struggling who needs to go out and get help in order to get better. You can't just magically make them feel better. And so because of this experience in my youth, by the time I was an adult, I was very adept at talking about my feelings to anyone who would listen because I was concerned if I didn't share, I might start bottling things up and then I would get depressed. However, it's really easy to talk openly about your feelings when your feelings are good and you feel okay. But when you feel really bad and sad and depressed, it's nearly impossible to tell people about how you feel. And so in 2017, when I started having really dark thoughts for the first time in my entire life, suddenly I was not able to tell people about it. Luckily, my family encouraged me to seek out professional help, and I did see a therapist, and ultimately, I really think that saved my life. So if you're struggling right now but feel like you can't talk to anyone about how you're feeling, consider giving BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your home. Get matched with a BetterHelp therapist after filling out a brief survey, and then you can talk to them however you feel most comfortable, whether it's through text, chat, video call, phone call, or some combination. And at any time, if you want to switch your therapist, it's easy and free to do so. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/MrBallen. I've also left a link in the description. When she got there, she ran inside and immediately told the ranger where her and Charles had been, which trail they were on, and where roughly they were on this trail when she had gone to the car and Charles had turned around and gone uphill to take a picture of something. And as Glenda told the ranger all these details about where they were inside of the park, he really started to look worried. And when Glenda was done explaining, he told her that, yes, we need to go right now and look for your husband, but I can't have you on that trail. It's too dangerous. And so this ranger had Glenda wait at the ranger station, and the ranger, by himself, headed back to the trailhead to go looking for Charles. And so the ranger, he gets to the trailhead, he hops out, he's got a rifle and a flashlight, and he begins walking along this trail, and by now, it's dark out. And so he's looking straight ahead with his flashlight and scanning side to side. He's calling out for Charles, and he's walking this trail. He gets all the way across the train tracks, through the meadow, and he gets to the steep section, and he actually begins going up this part of the trail until roughly the area where Glenda had described Charles going one way and her going back down. And when he got there, there was no sign of Charles, and so the ranger just took his rifle and fired 3 shots into the air, hoping that that might get Charles, if he was in the area, to hear him and call out or do something to indicate where he had gone. But after firing his gun, the ranger heard nothing. By this point, it was approaching midnight, it was totally pitch black outside, and the ranger knew that at this point, Charles was missing, and they really needed to organize a true search party to try to find him. But they would have to do that the next morning when they had light again. And so the ranger called out a few more times for Charles, and after not hearing anything, he reluctantly turned around and made his way back to his truck and drove back to the ranger station, where he would tell Glenda that he could not find her husband and they would now have to wait for sunrise. At sunrise the next morning, 20 searchers arrived at the trailhead where Charles and Glenda had been, and these searchers had dogs, and all the dogs had Charles's scent from some clothes that was in Glenda's car. And so this big search team very slowly and methodically began moving down this trail. And so they went across the abandoned road, over the train tracks, through the meadow with the white flowers. They got to the steep section of the trail, and they got all the way up to that point where Charles and Glenda had separated, and Charles had gone uphill to do whatever he was going to do. And it was at that point on the steep section that one of the searchers' dogs picked up Charles's scent and took off running uphill. And the searcher, whose dog this was, took off running after the dog, and the dog, it went up for a little while, up the steep rocky outcropping, and then it turned and began going down again until it reached a different meadow, so not the same one they walked through with the white flowers. This was farther away to the right, and in this meadow, the dog, who still very much had the scent, began to slow down, and it went straight for this tree. It was kind of a standalone tree right at the base of this steep section, and this tree had had low-hanging branches, maybe 5 feet off the ground, and the dog went right up to the tree, and then it stopped for a second, and the searcher by this point had caught up to the dog, and so he's looking at this tree, and he sees the ground looks really disturbed, and there's deep gouges in this tree, and then the dog went around this tree and sprinted another 50 feet or so, and then stopped, like it had found something. And when the searcher caught up to his dog, he looked down and he found what they feared the most. It was Charles, and he was deceased. His body was totally mangled, his arms and legs were eaten away, there were deep cuts and gouges all over his body, and there was a blood trail from Charles all the way back to this tree. Also, just a few feet from Charles's outstretched hand was a camera, Charles's camera. Now, it was obvious that something horrific had happened to Charles, and there were clear signs of a struggle that took place near this tree, and then also over here where he was found, there were clear marks on the ground that there was some sort of fight that happened right here. But interestingly, Charles was carrying a gun, but it appeared that he did not unholster it and he didn't fire it. Instead, it almost looked like whatever was happening to Charles, he refused to put his camera down, which is why it was so close to his hand when he finally died. And so it was decided that the only way to determine what happened to Charles would be to develop his camera, to figure out what he was taking pictures of before he died. And so authorities would send off Charles's camera roll to be developed, and 2 weeks later, when they got it back, they couldn't believe what they saw. The photos very clearly told the story of what happened to Charles. This is what happened after Charles left his wife on that trail. When Charles stopped his wife and signaled to her that he wanted to take one more picture up the trail, he had found a photographic opportunity of a lifetime. The warm spring weather that had drawn Charles and Glenda out of their house to Glacier National Park had also woken the grizzly bears in the park from their hibernation. And what Charles had seen up the trail was a mother grizzly bear and her 3 cubs. The first few photographs that Charles would take of these bears were shot from a good distance away, and it just showed the mother bear and her 3 babies just kind of sauntering around the rocks, not really paying any attention to Charles. To Charles, grizzly bears were the most majestic creatures in nature. He didn't just love them, he viewed them as if they were sort of magical in some way. He was always going to local town meetings to speak about grizzly bears' beauty, and we needed to defend their natural habitat. As such, anyone who knew Charles knew about his passion for grizzlies. And while of course Charles knew that grizzly bears were dangerous, he also thought that the bears, who were very smart and sensitive, could sense his own very gentle and protective feelings towards them, and so if he was around them, they would never perceive him as a threat. Charles had taken some very good photos of other bears, black bears, but he had never taken what he called the definitive grizzly bear photo. And it was going to be this definitive grizzly photo of the mother and her 3 cubs that would finally get him a spot in the Hungry Horse News publication. As Charles took more and more photos of these bears, you could see in the photos that Charles was getting closer and closer and closer to this mother bear and her cubs. It was obvious that he was tracking them, even as the mother bear and the cubs were clearly trying to walk away from him. Finally, when Charles got about 50 feet away from this family of grizzly bears, he must have kicked a rock or stepped on a twig that broke that startled the bears. And so the second to last photo that Charles would take of this family shows the mother bear very clearly turning around to look at Charles, and she's making perfect eye contact with him, as is one of her cubs. Charles would take one more photo, and in this photo you can see the bears are not just staring at Charles, they are running towards him, they are charging him. And it was likely after taking this photo that Charles realized the danger he was in. At this point, Charles tried to make a run for it by running down the side of this mountain. He got down to that tree with the low-hanging limbs, and he attempted to climb up into it, maybe hoping he could get one more picture of this bear if they would just leave him alone. But the mother bear and her cubs, they came charging down. They saw him up in the tree, and the mother bear began climbing into the tree, and she reached Charles. Now, she likely weighed about 400 pounds, and when mother grizzly bears are defending their young, they are absolutely merciless. And so she must have grabbed him or bit onto him and yanked him from the tree. And Charles somehow, after being pulled to the ground and getting slashed and bit by this bear, he managed to break away from her, as we can tell from the blood trail, and he made it about 50 feet away from this tree before the bear chased him down again, jumped on top of him, and killed him. When authorities figured out that Charles had managed to briefly get away from this mother grizzly bear and made it 50 feet away from her, they wondered why he hadn't pulled out his gun and shot at the bears to defend himself. But Charles's wife, Glenda, said it made perfect sense that Charles had not tried to harm this grizzly bear or her cubs. He loved grizzly bears, and he would never dream of leaving these 3 cubs without their mother. After Charles's death, the rangers did not attempt to track down this bear and her cubs and do anything to the bears, because they felt like the bears were just acting like bears and it was Charles who was in the wrong. And Charles's family and friends would say that is a decision that Charles would definitely support. Charles's photos of the grizzly bear family were published in the Hungry Horse News alongside an article about his death. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast. We have over 100 episodes. Many of them are exclusive to the podcast, so you can't get them on YouTube. The podcast is just called the MrBallen's Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. One September afternoon in Taiwan, a young man boarded a public bus for what he thought would be just an ordinary ride home. But it wasn't that. This ride would turn out to be the single most terrifying experience of this guy's life. And we don't just have to take his word for it, because this young man managed to capture a photo of the thing that was terrorizing him on this bus for hours. And so no matter what you think of the story, the picture is fascinating. So make sure you stick around till the end to see that photo. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, on garbage collection day, wake up really early, go to the Like Button's house, and take their full trash cans away from the curb and put them back in their yard, wait for the garbage trucks to come by, and then after they're gone, wheel the Like Button's garbage bins back out to the curb. Also, please subscribe. On the afternoon of September 4th, 2017, a young man named Zhu rushed through a bus station in southern Taiwan. Zhu's bus home to the capital city, Taipei, would be leaving any minute now, and because Zhu was running late, he knew the bus would be packed and he would get a terrible seat. And so Zhu just kept on running as fast as he could, and he finally saw his bus parked up against the curb on the outside of this bus station, and he ran up to it, totally winded, but glad that he hadn't missed his bus. And so the driver noticed Zhu standing there, and so he opened up the bus doors, and Zhu went on board, handed the driver his ticket, and the driver said, okay, take your seat, and Zhu turned, and he began walking down the aisle, and at first he almost didn't register the weirdness of the inside of this bus. I mean, he took this route all the time, and he was totally expecting this bus to be packed, but as he was walking down the aisle, he realized he was the only one on the bus. There was literally nobody else. It was just Zhu and the driver. And so for a second, Zhu thought maybe he had made a mistake and this was not his bus, but he checked his watch and, again, he had taken this bus many times and he knew this was it. And so he was about to turn and maybe ask the bus driver, but the bus driver shut the doors, turned on the engine, and began to pull away. And so Zhu just thought, well, I guess it's just my lucky day. I have the bus to myself. This is crazy. And so Zhu found a seat towards the front of the bus, and after sitting down and kind of getting situated, he just sat there and stared out the window as the driver, merged into traffic and eventually found their way onto the highway. And as they were just coasting along, Zhu really felt content. I mean, it really felt like he had this private ride all to himself, and this was not a short bus ride. It was like a 6-hour bus ride. And so the idea of just having peace and calm the whole time, that was so luxurious and unexpected. And so Zhu was just having a wonderful time, just kind of taking it all in, when all of a sudden he hears a woman coughing behind him. And remember, he's scanned the bus. It's empty. And so he whipped his head around, totally startled, like maybe there was somebody on the bus, but he looked behind him and there was no one.
And so very quickly, Zhu began to rationalize what he had just heard. He's looking around thinking, okay, one of the windows is slightly open. Maybe the wind was coming in weird and causing a sound, or maybe it wasn't behind me. Maybe that cough came from the driver, and somehow I thought it was back here. Zhu's telling himself that wasn't really a woman coughing because there's nobody here. And so before long, Zhu convinced himself that, that was just an anomaly. It was nothing to worry about. And he was back to just relaxing and enjoying this peaceful ride. And pretty soon after that, he began to drift off to sleep. A few hours later, Zhu woke up, and he was very groggy, and he looked out the window and saw it was dark, and he checked his watch and saw they were maybe about halfway to their destination, and then he looked at his phone and saw he had a text message from the friend he had just been visiting, the friend he had been with before he left and got on this bus. And the friend was basically asking Zhu how the ride home was going, and Zhu, he wrote back and said, you won't believe this, I'm on a bus that's completely empty, like I have the bus to myself. And this friend, who was familiar with how packed this particular ride to Taipei was like, no way, that bus is never not filled with people. You gotta send me proof. And so Zhu opened the camera on his phone, he turned around, and he snapped a photo of the back of the bus. But when he looked at the photo he had taken, it was very grainy, and there wasn't any light in the bus, and there wasn't a flash on his phone. And so instead, Zhu, who happened to be a semi-professional photographer, he pulled out his really nice high-quality digital camera out of his bag, and with that camera, he turned around and took a photo. But when Zhu looked at the photo he had just taken, he thought there was something wrong with it. And so he zoomed in on the photo, and he couldn't believe what he was looking at. And so he checked all the settings of his camera and checked the lens to make sure everything was working properly, and it was. And so starting to get kind of scared, Zhu put the camera down and walked to the back of the bus and walked up and down a couple of times, looking for some explanation of what was in that photo. But there was no explanation, and so now feeling really scared, Zhu went back to his seat, grabbed his phone to text his friend to be like, look what I found, but his phone was dead. Even though his phone had full battery like a minute ago, now his phone doesn't work and he can't turn it back on. And so Zhu's thinking, what do I do? Do I tell the bus driver about this photo? But he was worried if he showed the driver, it would be so startling that the driver might crash the bus. And so Zhu really felt completely alone and terrified, and he just placed his camera next to him and then just closed his eyes and began silently praying that he would get off this bus. But as he was doing that, he began to hear whispering right behind him, like numerous people whispering right behind him, and he whipped his head around, but again, there's nobody there. And so now, the fear is only getting more and more heightened inside of Zhu. He goes back to praying, and now, in addition to the whispers behind him, he starts to hear the sound of seats basically creaking as if somebody's sitting in them, kind of rocking back and forth. And now Zhu, he's too scared to turn around, and so he just keeps on praying, and the noise behind him, this cacophony of sounds, is getting louder and louder, and finally Zhu looks up at the driver, hoping the driver can hear the stuff, to confirm that Zhu's not losing his mind here. But the driver looked like he was just paying attention to the road, completely oblivious to what was happening inside of this bus. And so Zhu is horrified, has no idea what to do. These noises are not stopping, despite the fact nobody else is on this bus. And so Zhu finally plugged his ears just so he wouldn't hear it, and just tucked himself down in a ball and just continued to pray for the next 3 hours, all the way until the bus finally stopped. And when the bus stopped, Zhu unplugged his ears and opened his eyes, expecting to hear all these whispers and sounds, but the bus sounded totally quiet and normal. And the bus driver, was kind of going through the shutdown procedures of the bus. They were in the Taipei bus station. And so Zhu was feeling totally relieved here, and he couldn't wait to get off this bus. And so Zhu, he grabbed his camera and his things, packed them all up, and then as quick as he could, he began walking towards the front of the bus. But before Zhu got off the bus, the driver stopped him because he saw, Zhu looked horrible. He was sweating profusely. His skin was flushed. He looked like, something bad had just happened to him. And he asked Zhu, like, hey, are you okay? And Zhu was about to be like, oh, no, everything's fine, and just kind of get off the bus. But then he thought to himself, I have no explanation for what just happened, and that was horrifying. I don't know what that was. And I took this photo that I can't explain too, that seems definitely connected to all the noises I just heard. And now that the bus has stopped, there's no risk of showing the driver and risking scaring him so badly that we crash. And so Zhu thought, you know what, even if it makes me look crazy, I'm going to show the driver this photo and see what he thinks. And so Zhu was like, actually, let me show you something. So he pulls out his camera and he shows the driver the photo. And as the driver is kind of looking at the photo, not really sure what to look for, Zhu, he reaches down and he zooms in on the top half of the photo, and it expands the ceiling of the back of the bus. And you can very clearly see there is a huge human arm and hand extending off the ceiling, like it's reaching down into the bus. And so as the bus driver is studying this arm and hand, Zhu is saying, I thought for a second that could have been me, reflected off the ceiling or something, but I was holding the camera in my hand, and so wouldn't the camera be in the reflection? If that's my arm, wouldn't the camera be visible? Because it's not. And then Zhu also was like, I thought for a second maybe it was your arm, but you're driving the bus. Your hands are on the steering wheel. And so if this arm is your hand, wouldn't the steering wheel be in the reflection? Like, I don't understand how there's an arm with nothing in the hand reaching down from the ceiling. And then Zhu also told the driver that in addition to this totally terrifying photo of this ghost arm coming off the ceiling, there were all these weird whispers and sounds and noises behind him for the whole ride. Like, it was horrifying. And so after Zhu has detailed to this bus driver that basically your bus is haunted and I have photo proof, Zhu is expecting the driver to have a pretty big reaction to this. I mean, geez, this is pretty big news here. But the driver just handed the camera back to Zhu and basically turned to Zhu and said, you know what? You can't show this photo to anybody. Like, no one can know about what happens on my bus, because if they find out, it'll ruin my business. And Zhu's thinking, wait a minute, does this mean the bus is haunted? Is that what the bus driver is confirming here? He doesn't seem shocked. He seems like this is completely routine. This is what happens on his bus. And Zhu was about to protest and be like, are you kidding me? Like, why aren't you telling people about what's happening on your bus? But then Zhu was like, you know what? I don't know this guy. I don't care about this bus. You know what? I'm done with this. And so he said to the driver, don't worry, I won't tell anyone about, your haunted bus. I won't show anyone this photo. Thank you. And then Zhu got off the bus. When Zhu finally got to his house, it was around midnight and Zhu was exhausted. So he goes inside, he lays on his couch and he plugs his phone in because his phone was dead. And as soon as his phone turned on, he saw all these messages from his friend who had asked him to send proof that the bus he was on was really empty. And so Zhu wanted to tell his friend about all the crazy stuff that had happened on the bus. He wanted to send him that photo of, the ghost arm. But also Zhu had promised the bus driver not to share this information with anyone because it could destroy this guy's business. And so as he was sitting there kind of wondering how to respond, something caught Zhu's attention outside. And so he turned and looked out the window and he saw all these people walking down the road carrying red lanterns. And suddenly, everything sort of clicked for Zhu. It was September 5th, which is important because it marked the beginning of a big event in Taiwan known as the Hungry Ghost Festival, and the people Zhu saw outside walking around with red lanterns were clearly participating in this event. This festival is celebrated every year in Taiwan, and it's all about honoring the dead and feeding them with offerings. For example, people will burn fake money they call ghost money, and once it gets burned, the spirits of the dead can use that money during the ghost month. People in Taiwan believe that during this ghost month, the gates of heaven and hell open up, and spirits come out and walk the earth alongside all the living, which could be a great thing. If you have a dead loved one or friend or somebody, you can reconnect with them during this event, but it also can be a bad thing because sometimes angry spirits emerge from the gates of hell and they wreak havoc on the living. And so as soon as Zhu realized that, today was the start of this Hungry Ghost Festival, he realized why the day before when he was on that bus, he realized why it was empty. Because there's this superstition in Taiwan that September 4th, the day before this festival, is the day when all the spirits are traveling around the globe. And it's believed that that day is a very dangerous day for the living to be out and about, because you don't want to come in contact by accident with, one of the evil spirits. And so nobody travels on September 4th. But Zhu had just forgotten and just believed he had struck luck by having this empty bus. But then, as Zhu was kind of working this through in his mind, he was thinking, wait a minute, all that weird stuff on the bus, the whispers, the sounds, the ghost arm reaching out of the ceiling that he got on camera, was that some sign that he had just come in contact with an evil spirit? Was he now in danger? Was this spirit gonna follow him around and haunt him? He didn't know. But now he's thinking, oh my goodness, I did the thing I wasn't supposed to do, and now I could be paying the consequences for it. And so Zhu suddenly was like, you know what? I don't care that I made some promise to the bus driver about not disclosing this photo or what I experienced on the bus, because now this is like a me problem. I could have big issues here. And so he decided he would send this photo to his friend and tell his his friend about what he experienced on the bus to see what his friend thought. And so after messaging his friend wrote back that he was horrified by that photo, seeing that arm reaching down out of the ceiling. That was horrifying. And his friend didn't know what to make of it and did agree that, given the fact that the Hungry Ghost Festival has just started and you were out there on the day before, this isn't good. You could have come in contact with an evil spirit here. But his friend also gave Zhu some advice of how to handle this. He told Zhu to take that photo and post it on Facebook. Now that sounds kind of goofy, but in Taiwan, there's this belief that if you have bad luck, the best way to deal with bad luck is to basically dilute that bad luck by sharing it with other people. It's kind of like those old email forwards that people used to pass around, like, hey, forward this email along to 5 other people or else you'll have bad luck. It was kind of like that. Like, just share it with the world and, pass on your bad luck to other people, basically. And so Zhu's friend told Zhu, look, I know this isn't really bad luck we're dealing with here, but maybe if you just share this with the world, dilute what happened to you, maybe that will reduce the power this ghost has over you. It's worth a shot. And so Zhu posted the photo to Facebook, and it pretty much immediately went viral. Millions of people saw it, and this is what Zhu wanted. He wanted, max dilution here, show it to everybody to reduce the chances that this, entity can hurt him. But after all these people saw it, lots of people were spooked, and they began messaging Zhu, not like, don't worry, it's diluted now, but instead they were like, hey man, you're in trouble. This thing's gonna come after you. You need to seek real help here. You're in danger. And so this ended up freaking out Zhu more than the photo did in some way. It just made the whole situation feel far more real. And so Zhu ended up deleting the photo on Facebook, setting his Facebook to private, and basically staying off social media. And then he just kind of hoped and prayed that if he did nothing and just stayed home and kind of minded his own business, that he'd be okay. And after a few days, when nothing did happen, ultimately he just told himself, I'm okay. There's no ghosts here. I'm fine. But exactly 1 week after Zhu had got off the bus, so September 11th, 2017, Zhu is in his house, he's laying on the couch, not really thinking about what had happened on the bus, and as he's scrolling social media, he comes across this headline about this horrible accident out on the highway not far from where he lived. And it was this one vehicle that got into this huge wreck, and 6 people were killed and 11 others were injured. I mean, it's this horrible, horrible accident. And as Zhu is reading the article and scrolling down, he comes across a photo of the driver of this vehicle who's covered head to toe in blood. He looks totally haggard. He's standing out on this dark highway, and Zhu realizes the driver of the vehicle was the bus driver from when he had that horrible experience on the bus. It's the same guy. And so Zhu's like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? He scrolls down and he realizes the vehicle that crashed was the exact same bus he had been riding in when all this stuff happened. It was the same bus driver, same bus on the exact same route that this accident happened. And so obviously this is like a horrifying coincidence. Zhu very likely was thinking, I'm so lucky this didn't happen when I was on the bus. But when you take into context what Zhu experienced on that bus just a week earlier, the photo, the sounds, all of it, this story gets even weirder. Because the official story is the driver was negligent, and that's what caused the crash. That's it. And he actually went to jail for negligence. But there's video footage taken from inside of the bus right before it crashed, and in the final 30 seconds, something strange happens. The driver does not seem distracted at all, he's just driving along, but then something catches his attention, something off to his side. And you can tell right away he notices whatever this thing is, and he's turning, he's looking at this thing, he's not really paying attention to the road, and he starts reaching down. I mean, he's interacting with something in the bus, and you can't see it on camera. And as he gets more and more into dealing with whatever's happening over here, the bus crashes. Now, the driver never gave any public testimony about what was going on right before he crashed. All we have is the fact that it crashed, and this video footage, and Zhu's experience and that photo he took. And when you put it all together, it really makes you wonder if there was any truth to there really being some evil spirit on that bus that maybe did cause this crash. Or is it just a series of unexplainable coincidences? You be the judge. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
On April 29th, 2002, in the small town of Pataskala, Ohio, a social worker sat on the floor with a 2-year-old girl. This little girl's mother had unfortunately been murdered in their kitchen just the night before, and police thought this little girl might have actually witnessed the crime. And so now the social worker was trying to get this little girl to see if she could remember if anybody else was here the night before. And at first, the little girl just clutched her stuffed animal and didn't say anything. But eventually, after some gentle really the kind of scene you could bring a baby to. A lot of the guys Dave hung around with were hard drinkers and drug addicts and ex-cons. And so now, after almost 4 years of marriage, Rhonda was finally starting to see Dave for what he was, which was not carefree. Dave was really just kind of reckless. The phone rang and Rhonda picked it up. And as expected, it was Dave. And what Rhonda really wanted to say to him was that she was upset and seriously considering divorce, and that in fact, she'd already taken his name off her retirement plan. But at the same time, she saw her mother-in-law standing in the doorway, clearly listening, and so instead of saying what she really wanted to say, she just said, "Hey Dave, how are you doing?" An hour later, back at her own home, Rhonda put a casserole into the oven, and then she turned on cartoons for Amanda, and then went outside to mow the lawn before it got too dark. Rhonda was used to doing almost everything around the house herself, since Dave was practically never home anyway. But now that he was, in jail, she had to literally do everything, including, mowing the grass on a Sunday night. So Rhonda wheeled the lawnmower out of the garage and into the yard, and then she pulled the cord to start the engine. But like everything else in their little house, the lawnmower was on the verge of breaking down, and it kept shutting off. While Rhonda struggled, she noticed her neighbor coming out of the house across the street, and he waved to Rhonda as he came down his own driveway, sort of telling her like, hey, turn off that lawnmower. And once she did, and once it was quiet enough to actually hear each other, he shouted from across the street and asked if she wanted to borrow his lawnmower that did work. Rhonda found herself looking around the yard at all the tall grass and saw how dark it was already getting. And then she checked her watch and saw that, her casserole was going to be done in just a minute here. And so she said to her neighbor that she really appreciated the offer, but it didn't really matter because, you know what, she doesn't have time to do this anyways. She has to go back inside. So Rhonda said bye to her neighbor and then pushed her defective lawnmower back inside the garage. And then she made a mental note to call Dave's cousin, Nick, the following day to see if maybe he could come by and fix her lawnmower. Nick worked as a maintenance man at a big apartment complex, and even though he lived 45 minutes away, he'd been helping Rhonda around the house while Dave was behind bars. Just last week, he had fixed up her washing machine, and he called all the time just to check in. And so now, Rhonda went back inside the house, into the kitchen, and took the casserole out of the oven just before the timer rang. She cut the casserole into 2 pieces and brought those pieces into the dining room and set them on the table. Then she walked over and turned off the TV, scooped up her daughter, and brought her over to the table. It was getting late, and all Rhonda really wanted to do here was just eat quickly and go to bed. But for every bite that made it into Amanda's mouth, another wound up on the floor. And so Rhonda knew that, at the end of dinner, she would have to do another round of cleanup before she could finally go to sleep. But Rhonda knew, Amanda couldn't help it. She was a little kid. And so she reached over and took her daughter's fork and began helping her eat, to not only minimize the mess, but also to help her kid out. And in reality, Amanda was actually the thing preventing Rhonda from just pulling the trigger on a divorce. She didn't know if she could handle being a single mother. It was hard enough having Dave gone for a few weeks, that she couldn't even imagine doing this all alone by herself forever. And since she already knew Dave was bad at paying child support, as that is the reason he was in jail right now, she figured if she was a single mom, even if he was ordered to pay her, she would likely have to rely on paying the bills herself. She would need to get a job and make money. Now, Rhonda did have a job now as an office assistant, but she wasn't sure if that would be enough to fully support herself and her daughter without any additional financial help. But just then, as Rhonda was scooping up another bite of casserole for her daughter, she heard a noise outside that almost sounded like heavy footsteps. She turned around, and through the curtains, she could see the silhouette of a person clearly coming up her driveway. The next morning, Monday, April 29th, Rhonda's coworker, Gary Pulowski, noticed that Rhonda was running late for her shift in the office at Hamilton Home Products, which was a heating equipment company. And this was strange because Rhonda had actually never been late before in the entire time that she had worked there. So Gary began asking around to see if anybody knew where Rhonda was or if maybe she'd called in or something. But his coworkers all shrugged and said they hadn't heard from her since she left the office on Friday night. And so eventually, Gary tried calling Rhonda's landline at her house to see if she was home. But after calling several times, Rhonda never picked up. He waited for a while to see if maybe she would call back. But when he still hadn't heard from her after an hour, he started to worry that, she might have run into car trouble. Like maybe she was stranded somewhere with her car. He knew it was about a 15-mile drive from her house in Pataskala to the office here, just outside of Columbus. And back in 2002, not everyone had a cell phone, and he didn't know if she did. So if her car had broken down, she might be stranded without a way to call for help. And so Gary decided he would just get in his own car and drive the route from the office back to her house to literally see if he could find Rhonda on the side of the road. Gary drove all the way out to Pataskala, keeping his eyes peeled for Rhonda's car on the side of the road, but there was no sign of it. It was not until he finally turned the corner onto Rhonda's street that he saw her car, and her car was parked in the driveway of her white-paneled one-story house. And at this, Gary's stomach kind of balled up into a knot, because he realized that, Rhonda had clearly not left for work at all. And he knew that if she had just stayed home this whole time without calling in or calling anybody back, that something bad had to have happened. And so Gary pulled up to her house, and he got out of his car and walked up to the front door, and he knocked, but there was no answer. So after a minute, he went around and knocked on the back door, and there was still no answer back there either. So he walked back around to the front of the house, and he was about to leave when he saw the drapes rustling in one of the front windows. He squinted at the window, and he saw, what was causing the movement of the drapes was Rhonda's toddler daughter, Amanda, looking out the window. And her face was red like she'd been crying for a long time. And so now, Gary started to panic. But he tried to keep his voice calm as he ran over and shouted through the window and told Amanda he was a friend of her mother's and convinced her to open the door so he could help her. It took a minute for Amanda to figure out what Gary was asking, but eventually she got it, and she disappeared from the window, and a moment later, the front door opened. And so Gary walked over and he stepped through the front door, and the first thing he saw were bloody footprints on the living room carpet. Gary instinctively scooped Amanda up in his arms, and he ran across the street, banged on the neighbor's door, and told them to call the police. Not long after, Pataskala police would arrive at Rhonda's house, and they would search the inside, and they would find Rhonda, and she was found stabbed to death in her own kitchen. This was the first homicide in Pataskala in 6 years, and there were only 17 officers in the whole police department, and the crime scene unit was run out of a refurbished ambulance. So, Police Chief Chris Forshee didn't have a ton of resources to throw at this case, but he called in all available officers and sent them to the crime scene. And then he headed out there himself to make sure they did the job right. By the time Forshee pulled up to the house, his officers had already sealed off the perimeter. He ducked under the crime scene tape, walked inside the house, and followed the sound of footsteps and clicking cameras into the kitchen, where a woman was lying in a pool of blood on the tile floor. An officer told Forshee that the victim had been identified as Rhonda Boggs, and it was her coworker who had come to check on her when she hadn't shown up for work that morning that ultimately prompted a 911 call that led to the discovery of the body. The officer also told Forshee that Rhonda's toddler daughter had been found, uninjured, in the house with her body. And so Forshee knelt down to examine the body. And right away, he saw at least, more than a dozen stab wounds on Rhonda's head, her neck, her chest, and her shoulders. The sheer number of wounds and the blood all over the kitchen suggested there had to have been a struggle, and that from the looks of it, Rhonda had fought very hard with her attacker. The remnants of what appeared to be a casserole were sitting on the stove, and Rhonda was fully dressed. So Forshee figured the crime must have happened sometime before she went to bed, so between dinner and bedtime. And then Forshee wondered if, her poor daughter had been awake, or maybe even in the room, when this happened. After the scene had been photographed, Forshee gave the green light for the coroner to actually physically lift Rhonda's body up off the ground onto a stretcher. And when the coroner's staff hoisted her up, Forshee noticed something lying underneath her body. It was a steak knife with blood all over the blade. Forshee looked around the kitchen and realized the black handle on that knife matched the set of knives on the countertop. It appeared that Rhonda had been killed with a knife from her own kitchen, which meant her killer did not show up to the house with their murder weapon. This suggested that this murder was likely a heat-of-the-moment crime, rather than something that had been planned out. While Forshee's officers finished collecting forensic evidence in the kitchen, Forshee himself walked through the rest of the house. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. The jewelry box in the bedroom was empty, and the dresser drawers were open, and piles of Rhonda's clothes were strewn all over the floor. And then in the dining room, they found a purse that had been overturned with all of its contents spilled out, and clearly it looked like somebody had been sifting through it. And so Forshee thought that, between the sort of ransacked appearance of the house and also the weapon of opportunity, that it seemed like this could have been a robbery gone wrong. However, there was one factor that did seem to complicate things, or at least make it seem like this could have been something else, and that was that there was no sign of forced entry. Just then, Forshee heard a commotion near the front door, and so he walked over, and he saw there was a woman trying to push her way into the house. And her face was all red, and she was crying, and she was shouting at the officers, demanding to know what happened. Forshee took this woman outside and tried to calm her down, and she would eventually tell him that her name was Kim Davis, and she was Rhonda's sister. Once she'd caught her breath, Forshee explained to her what he already knew, which was that unfortunately her sister Rhonda had been found stabbed to death inside of her home, and the running theory at this point, at least his theory, was this was a robbery gone wrong. And potentially, because there was no sign of forced entry, it could indicate that it was somebody that, Rhonda potentially knew and who she would have, let into the house if she saw them. Now, Kim was obviously extremely upset by this, and so for a minute, Forshee just consoled her. But he really needed to kind of press this investigation, and so once she had kind of calmed down a little bit, he asked her if she knew of anybody who might have wanted to hurt Rhonda. And Kim immediately said no. She couldn't imagine her sister having any enemies. But after sitting with that question for a moment, Kim said that actually there was one person who might have had a problem with Rhonda, and that was her husband, Dave. Kim said that Rhonda and Dave's marriage had been on the rocks for a while, and in fact, Rhonda had told her recently that she was thinking about getting a divorce. But Kim said, Dave actually is currently in jail, so I don't see how he could have done this. He was literally in jail at the time this happened. Still, though, she thought it was possible that, Dave could have been involved one way or another. He might have paid somebody to come here and do this, or maybe put one of his friends up to it. Forshee promised Kim he would look into this, but he was already feeling pretty skeptical. I mean, if Dave couldn't even pay child support, what was the likelihood that he was able to afford a hitman? And also, the murder weapon appeared to come from Rhonda's kitchen, and so that didn't really suggest that the suspect had been planning to kill her when they got there. So again, sort of takes away from the idea that a hitman was used in this murder. But at this point, Forshee thought their best chance to figure out what actually happened here was actually to speak to the only other person who was at the scene of the crime that they knew about, and that was Rhonda's own 2-year-old daughter, Amanda. Later that day, a social worker from Child Services pulled up outside the house, and Forshee walked out to greet her. And he said to her that before she took custody of Amanda, he was hoping that, she could help him talk to this girl and see what she knew about the murder, because she was here, when it happened, and there was nobody else who witnessed it but her. The social worker nodded, and so Forshee took her across the street to the neighbor's house, where Amanda had been staying all morning. Now, Forshee didn't know if this little girl would be able to tell them anything at all. I mean, of course, she could be in complete shock. She's also 2. And he also knew that even if she did tell them stuff, they wouldn't necessarily be reliable because, again, she's 2 years old and she very likely is in shock. But regardless, Forshee knew he had to try. So he stood in the corner of the living room while the social worker sat down on the floor with Amanda and asked her what she had seen the night before. And to Forshee's surprise, the little girl looked up at the social worker and she jerked her little hand toward her neck in what looked very much like a stabbing motion. And then in a quiet voice, she said her mother had fallen down and gone to sleep. Then the social worker asked her if anybody else had been there. And Forshee felt himself holding his breath, waiting for Amanda to answer. And there was a moment of silence before Amanda said, "Uncle Nick." A few hours later, Chief Forshee was still at the crime scene when 2 officers pulled up in a cruiser and took this grungy-looking man out of the back seat and escorted him into the house. This was not the Uncle Nick that Amanda had named. It was Amanda's own father, Dave Boggs, who had been in jail when his wife was murdered. Now, Forshee was absolutely planning to speak to this Uncle Nick, but first he wanted to gather as much information as possible about him. During Amanda's conversation with the social worker, she had said repeatedly that Uncle Nick had hurt Mommy. But even though this 2-year-old girl seemed very definitive about this, Forshee needed an adult perspective before he acted. A judge had let Dave Boggs out of jail early because of his wife's murder, and Forshee had ensured that Dave was escorted to the crime scene so Forshee could speak to him before Dave got a chance to speak to anybody else. And so now Forshee met Dave and the officers at the door and then guided them into the living room where they sat Dave down on the couch. They filled him in on what had happened to his wife, but really before he could react to that, they also told him that they needed him to do a walkthrough of the house with them to try to identify what might have been stolen, which could help them figure out who did this. But first, Forshee said he had a very important question. He asked Dave, "Who is Uncle Nick?" And at this, Dave, who to this point had just looked completely shocked by what he was being told, began to look more confused. And he told Forshee that Uncle Nick was what his daughter called his second cousin. He said his real name was Richard Nicholas Robinson, and he had been helping Rhonda out while Dave was in jail. Dave said Nick had probably been at the house almost every day, fixing one thing or another, but he said he didn't understand why Forshee was asking about him because, there's no way he would have hurt Rhonda. I mean, he really looked out for her, and also for Amanda. But for now, Forshee was not going to answer that question. Dave's information was enough for him to go outside, get on his radio, and broadcast a bulletin asking all police departments in the area to be on the lookout for Nick Robinson. Less than an hour later, a police cruiser found Nick Robinson's SUV on State Route 37 just outside of Pataskala, and they pulled him over and they ordered him out of the vehicle, and as soon as he was out, they pushed him to the ground with a gun to the back of his head and cuffed him. And as they did this, they noticed a dark spot on Nick's baseball cap that looked a lot like blood. As they put Nick in the back of the cruiser, he kept asking them what was going on, but they didn't tell him. Instead, they searched his SUV, and there was cardboard laid out in the back with reddish-brown smears all over it, which also appeared to be blood. And then when the officers got back into their cruiser, Nick asked them, "Is this about Rhonda?" By the time this arrest happened, Chief Forshee was at Nick Robinson's house questioning his wife, Debbie. So while he did that, he dispatched one of his best and only detectives, Bruce Brooks, to go down to police headquarters to handle Nick's interrogation. When Detective Brooks walked into the interview room, immediately he could see that Nick, who was resting his head in his hands, looked very pale and nauseous. When he asked him if he was okay, Nick said he was just hungover from a long night of drinking. He said he had been at a bar in Columbus until around 10:30 p.m., and then he had gone to another bar in Lancaster, which was a town nearby where he lived, and then he had finally come home around 1:30 a.m. and passed out on his couch. Nick swore he didn't know anything about what happened to Rhonda, and only found out she was dead when he saw it on the news. And as for the blood the police found in his SUV, he said it was just animal blood from a hunting trip. But Brooks was not buying this, because he had heard Amanda, Rhonda's daughter, say Uncle Nick hurts Mom. And while, of course, you can't take a 2-year-old's testimony as absolutely reliable, but when she had said it, she said it very definitively and even gestured at her neck like she was stabbing herself. And Rhonda was found stabbed to death. So he asked Nick, if his alibi essentially was that he was too drunk to have committed this murder. Well, then how could he be sure, given he was too drunk, that he hadn't killed Rhonda in an alcohol-fueled blackout? If he can't remember, it's just as likely that he could have done it. But Nick just shook his head and said no. And no seemed to be Nick's answer to just about every question Brooks asked him. And eventually, the detective got frustrated, because basically everything he asked Nick, he denied. And so eventually he told Nick that Rhonda's daughter had seen the whole thing. And he told him to imagine that little girl on the witness stand, having some defense lawyer poke and prod her about the most traumatic event she had ever experienced, the murder of her own mother. And when he said that, a crack seemed to appear in Nick's sort of outward demeanor of denial, like clearly he saw how awful this thing really was. And then finally, a little after midnight, so 6 hours into this interrogation, Nick just agreed to take a lie detector test. And when the results came back, it showed very clearly that Nick had failed. He had lied. But instead of confessing at this point, Nick dug in and swore up and down that he really was innocent. So Brooks pulled out the last threat he could think of, which was that if Nick didn't confess now, he could be looking at the death penalty. And at that point, it was very clear. Nick cracked. That absolutely affected him. And so after a long silence following this threat of the death penalty, Nick said that, maybe he did have something to do with what happened, but he just couldn't remember it. From there on, Brooks kept on pushing and pushing until around 5 a.m. when Nick finally completely broke down and confessed to the murder. He said he had gone to Rhonda's house in between the 2 bars that he had visited, and he tried to kiss her. She pulled away and she grabbed a knife, and when Nick tried to take the knife from her, he said he accidentally stabbed her. As the sun came up, officers drove Nick to the Licking County Jail and officially booked him for Rhonda's murder. Later that morning, Chief Forshee stood in front of a group of reporters outside the police station and praised his officers for catching Rhonda Boggs' killer and getting a confession in less than 24 hours. But later that week, Detective Brooks was in his office wrapping up paperwork when a secretary stuck her head in the door and said there was somebody on the phone for him. Brooks picked it up, and the man on the other end of the line introduced himself as Bob Sisko. And he said he was the bandmate of Rhonda's husband, Dave Boggs, and he did not think Nick was guilty of this murder. Bob said on the evening that Rhonda was killed, another one of their former bandmates, a guy named Chris Williams, had stopped by his house. And Chris had seemed very nervous and sort of keyed up. He was pacing around and smoking cigarette after cigarette, and it just seemed like he was very mentally preoccupied with something. Now, Bob said Chris had actually in the past already robbed Rhonda and Dave's house. He had stolen a bunch of band equipment and sold it for drug money. And so when Bob Sisko saw on the news that, Rhonda was dead and her house appeared to have been robbed, he couldn't shake this feeling that Chris might have been involved. It just seemed too similar to be a coincidence. Brooks wrote all this down and thanked Bob for the information, but he wasn't sure how seriously to take this tip. since they already had a confession from their primary suspect. But he spoke to Forshee, and the chief decided to go ahead and re-interview Rhonda's 2-year-old daughter, just to cover their bases. A few days later, so about 2 weeks after Rhonda's murder, Chief Forshee waited by the phone in his office, anxiously watching the clock. He knew that the social worker who had spoken to Amanda the first time was in the process of interviewing her a second time, and any minute now, this social worker should be calling him with an update. Now, Forshee was hopeful that the little girl would just repeat the same story that she had told on the day of her mother's murder. But when his phone finally rang and Forshee picked it up, he learned that that is not what happened. The social worker said that this time, when she asked Amanda who she saw on the night of the murder, she did not say anything about Uncle Nick. Instead, she said, Bob did it. When Forshee heard this, he immediately got a pretty anxious feeling. He'd been afraid from the beginning that, a toddler was not a reliable eyewitness, and she could just be throwing out whatever names popped into her head. But he also thought it was a very strange coincidence that of all the people she could have named other than Uncle Nick, she said Bob. The same guy who had just called the station trying to, cast blame onto some other guy the police had never even heard of. Something just felt off. But as Forshee thought about it, he decided, it didn't really change anything. Nick had already confessed, like he said he did this. So they didn't really need Amanda as a witness to make the charges against Nick stick. 5 days later, a grand jury officially indicted Nick on murder charges. And to the huge surprise of investigators, Nick pled not guilty. So he was now claiming he had given a false confession and that he was not Rhonda Boggs' killer. About 7 months later, in December of 2002, a man named Matt Sauer stepped into a bar called Merry Melodies in Columbus, Ohio. He went up to the counter and pulled a manila folder out of his messenger bag, and he asked the bartender if he recognized the man in the photograph inside. The bartender looked down at the photo for a second, and then looked back up at Sauer and nodded and said, "Yes, that's Nick Robinson. He was here 8 months ago, on the night of the murder, and I've been waiting for you guys to come here and talk to me about it, because I know he was here on the night of the murder." Sauer was kind of caught off guard by how sure the bartender was, and so he asked them, how can you be so sure it was him, and how do you know he was here on the night of the murder? How can you remember that? But the bartender had a quick answer. He said the reason he remembered Nick is he had been wearing this very unique, unforgettable t-shirt that night with this obscene joke on it about women's bodies, so he just remembered it. Bartender said Nick had stayed there on the night of the murder until 10:15 or maybe 10:30. The bartender was absolutely certain. And so again, the bartender said to Sauer, I'm just pretty surprised it took this long for you all to come here and confirm his whereabouts. I've known this. Sauer closed his folder and thanked the bartender and then just set his business card down on the counter. And when the bartender picked it up, he looked surprised because Matt Sauer was not actually a police officer. He was a private investigator, and he'd been hired by Nick Robinson to clear his name. Sauer knew this was going to be a tough job because Nick had already confessed to Rhonda Boggs' murder. But Sauer was hoping that this interview with the bartender would help him poke a massive hole in the case against him. And so now that Sauer had gotten this testimony from the bartender that did appear to poke this hole in the case, Sauer left the bar, got in his car, and drove to the second bar Nick had claimed to be at on the night of Rhonda's murder. It was called the Fairview Inn in Lancaster. And when he got there, he showed that staff the same photo, and just like the first bartender, they all remembered Nick as well. They said he was there on the night of April 28th, the night of the murder, and they remembered because of his distinctive t-shirt. And so now Sauer knew he was onto something, because the prosecution's case said that Nick had left Merry Melody's bar, that first bar Sauer had gone to, driven to Rhonda's house and killed her, and then went to this bar, the Fairview Inn. But the staff at both bars said Nick was wearing the same distinctive t-shirt. And Sauer knew that if Nick had stabbed Rhonda to death in between these two bars, wouldn't that shirt have been covered in blood? And wouldn't, the Fairview Inn staff have not just remembered that it was this distinctive shirt, but the distinctive shirt that had blood all over it? That would also be a detail they would recall. But they didn't. They just said he had that shirt on, nothing else. A few days later, Sauer drove back to Mary Melody's bar, but this time he didn't go inside. Instead, he just pulled his car into their parking lot and started his stopwatch. And then once it was going, he pulled out of the parking lot, turned down the street, and drove all the way to Fairview Inn. And when he reached their parking lot, he checked his stopwatch, and the drive had taken, about 45 minutes. The prosecution's case against Nick had him leaving Mary Melody's bar, murdering Rhonda, and driving all the way to the Fairview, all within 30 to 45 minutes. But Sauers' experiment here with his stopwatch proved there was simply no way for Nick to have driven all the way to Rhonda's house, committed the murder, and then made it back to the Fairview Inn in that same window of time. It just wasn't possible. Which meant Nick's alibi was airtight and he could not have been the killer. Now, Sauer just had to figure out who actually was. Matt Sauer showed the evidence he had found to Nick's defense attorney, who then brought that evidence to the judge in the case, and they also asked the judge for an order to test a key piece of evidence that the Pataskala police had never even sent to the crime lab, the murder weapon. And so the judge agreed to test the knife, and a month later, in January of 2003, the evidence came back from the lab, and they discovered there was DNA on the knife from someone other than Rhonda. Investigators were not sure who the DNA belonged to, because back in 2003, it isn't like you had this huge bank to test it against. You basically had to test DNA one-to-one. But they were able to do that with Nick's DNA, and were able to confirm that it was not his DNA on the murder weapon. And so this cast serious doubt on Nick as a suspect, but it wasn't enough to clear his name. Not until Sauer could figure out who that other set of DNA belonged to. And so Sauer dug through the police files on the case, and he realized there were a lot of potential suspects the police had never even bothered to look at closely, or at all. There was Rhonda's soon-to-be ex-husband, Dave, who'd been flagged by Rhonda's sister on day one. Dave obviously could not have committed the murder himself because he was in jail. But, like the sister suggested, it's possible he could have recruited somebody else to do it. And so all of Dave's friends, his acquaintances, the people he met in jail potentially, were suspects too. There was also Chris Williams, the former bandmate who had previously robbed Dave and Rhonda's house once before and sold Dave's guitars for drug money. And of course, there was Bob Sisko, the man who had actually called in the tip about Chris. And at one point, Rhonda's own daughter had said Bob had been in the house during the murder. And so maybe that was Bob Sisko. Any of those people could have been Rhonda's killer. But since there was so little investigation done, Sauer was essentially starting over from square one, almost 9 months after the crime. The killer could even be somebody who the police never even knew about, because they had never really even bothered to focus on anybody but Nick. And so with little concrete to go off of, Sauer decided that, before he began investigating 87 different people, he would start with the sort of one concrete thing he had, which is they knew what items had been taken from Rhonda's house during the murder. And so what he decided he would do is try to track down those items, and hopefully they would lead him to the actual killer. A few days later, Sauer stepped into a pawn shop in Columbus and walked slowly down the aisle, scanning the shelves for some of the items that he knew had been taken from Rhonda and Dave's house. But like all the other pawn shops he'd been to that day, he hadn't found anything, and when he got to the end of this aisle, he knew this pawn shop as well did not have any of these missing items. Now, it was entirely possible that the items that had been stolen had not been pawned off yet, or maybe they had been pawned off in some other part of the country or something, but it just seemed kind of likely that if they had been pawned, they might be sort of roughly in the area. But so far, he had not found anything promising. And so after leaving this pawn shop and going to another and then another and still not finding any of the stolen items, Sauer finally decided to call it a day and head back home. However, on his ride back home, Sauer found himself stopped at a stoplight. And as he was idling there, he just happened to look out the window, and on the other side of the road, he saw a Bureau of Motor Vehicles, a DMV. And when he saw the DMV, it was like something kind of rattled loose in his mind. He remembered that one of the persons of interest on his list had been arrested for car theft about a week after Rhonda's murder. But according to the police files, that suspect owned a car of their own, a blue Cadillac. So why would they need to steal another car if they already owned one? And so on a whim, Sauer pulled into the parking lot of this DMV. He went inside and he went up to one of the clerks and he asked them to look into this particular blue Cadillac. He gave the clerk the license plate number, and he quickly found out that on April 30th, 2002, so one day after Rhonda's body had been found, that blue Cadillac had been sold to a woman in Columbus whose name was Letitia Gordon. And so Sauer left the DMV and drove straight to Letitia's house, and he knocked on the door. And the woman who opened it looked a bit scared when he introduced himself as an investigator, but she also did not seem surprised. Letitia told Sauer that she knew why he was there. It was because of the blue Cadillac that she had bought. She said that she had bought that car off a stranger right off the street who had offered to sell it to her for just $300, something she couldn't pass up. However, when she got home with this new car, she looked inside of it, and she found there was all the stuff piled up in the back of the car, which included clothes, jewelry, and a purse with somebody's photo ID inside. And the name on that ID was Rhonda Boggs. And so, with his suspicions now confirmed, Sauer was finally able to reconstruct what really happened to Rhonda Boggs on the night of April 28, 2002. On that night, while Rhonda Boggs was finishing up dinner with her 2-year-old daughter, her killer was parking their blue Cadillac just down the block. They eventually got out and stormed over to Rhonda's house in a total fury, with their heart pounding and their heads swimming, and they stomped up her driveway and they rang the doorbell. And when Rhonda opened up the door, she looked confused and a bit scared to see this person. She asked them what they were doing there, but the killer just brushed past her and stormed into her house, into the kitchen, and began digging through her purse right on the counter. Rhonda tried to stop them, but when she put her hands on them, the killer, without any hesitation, grabbed a nearby steak knife and stabbed Rhonda in the chest. Rhonda, she fell to the ground and tried to stand back up and tried to defend herself, but the killer was on top of her, stabbing her over and over and over again until Rhonda was no longer moving. The killer at that point stood up and backed away from Rhonda's body, which was now lying there in a pool of blood on the kitchen tile. And then they just proceeded to ransack the house and stole whatever money and valuables they could find. And then as they were about to leave, they saw a toddler just standing in the hallway, watching them. The killer paid the child no mind and just hurried right past them out of the house, got back into their blue Cadillac, and spent the rest of the night on a massive drug binge. And then the next morning, they sold that blue Cadillac to a woman in Columbus on the street, accidentally leaving Rhonda's stolen purse, her ID, and jewelry in the back of that car. And nearly a year later, those items would lead investigators to the killer. The killer was Chris Williams, Dave Boggs' former bandmate who had robbed him and Rhonda once before. On the night of the murder, he was high on crack and needed money for his next hit, and Rhonda unfortunately got in the way. Chris was charged with Rhonda's murder, and on March 28, 2005, he was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 20 years to life for Rhonda's murder and a total of 28 years for aggravated robbery, burglary, and escaping from a halfway house. After Chris Williams was charged, all the charges against Nick Robinson were dropped. And for Nick Robinson, this completely changed his life, not just because now he was free, but once he came back home, he stopped drinking and he returned to work, and he sued the city of Pataskala for $3 million in damages. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In 1988, a waitress who was living in Central Florida had just begun her shift at a local diner when she's standing in the middle of the restaurant and her heart just starts racing like mad. Now, she had not been running around or doing any heavy lifting, so it didn't make any sense. And so kind of startled by what was happening, she just turned around and went straight into the bathroom and sat down in a stall, waiting for this sensation to pass. But as she sat there, her heart just continued to beat like mad, and then she began to feel tingling in her feet and in her arms. And it was at that moment that she realized she was having a heart attack. Except she wasn't. Something much, much worse was happening to her. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come ballroom dancing with you, but when you get out on the dance floor, just start stomping all over their feet, but don't acknowledge it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't He was born in 1947 in a very small rural town in central Florida to parents who were deaf and who had almost no money. So from a young age, Peggy had to go to work, except the only jobs she could land were either extremely low paying or they were just outright dangerous, like overnight shifts at isolated truck stops on deserted highways where she would waitress there all by herself. But Peggy never complained about her job prospects. Instead, she just took whatever jobs were available because she knew that she and her family needed the money. And whenever she was working in a dangerous environment, she would intentionally put on this very tough exterior to make sure no one attempted to take advantage of her. And despite her small stature, she quickly developed a reputation amongst her coworkers as somebody you did not want to mess with. Peggy didn't take crap from anybody. But while this kind of prickly outer shell protected her from potential predators, it also warded off potential romantic partners that might have been interested in her, but were kind of intimidated when they interacted with her. But eventually, one man would cut through Peggy's defenses, and they would fall in love, and they would get married, and they would have 3 kids together, and everything was great. Until it wasn't. The marriage would crash and burn, and so by the mid-1980s, Peggy was a mid-30-somethings divorced mother of 3 teenage children who had to work overtime at a local diner just to barely make ends meet. And while she still acted very tough and composed when she was working or when she was out in public, when she was behind closed doors at her home with her kids, they saw the real side of Peggy. And that side was just kind of sad. I mean, life had just been kind of hard on her, and she had tried so hard to provide a safe and happy home for her kids, and she felt like she had kind of let them down. But her kids, on the other hand, were not bitter towards their mother for the divorce. It just pained them to see her so upset. And so her kids really hoped that one day their mom would meet somebody new, she would fall in love all over again, and maybe that would put a smile back on her face. And in late 1987, that is exactly what happened. That year, Peggy met a man named Perry Ellen Carr. Perry Ellen, who just went by his nickname, Pie, was a lot like Peggy. He was a recently divorced single father of 2 teenage children. He didn't take crap from anyone, and like Peggy, he had been kind of forced to start working at a fairly young age. When Peggy met him, he was living with his 2 kids in another tiny central Floridian rural town called Alturas, and he was the foreman of a local phosphate mining company there. Phosphate is a chemical that has a number of industrial and consumer uses. So Peggy and Pie, they start dating, and right away, Peggy's kids notice this huge shift in their mother. I mean, now she's all smiles, she's so happy. It seems like Pie is the knight in shining armor that's come to save the day. And then, just a couple of months later, in April of 1988, Pie and Peggy would get married, much to their children's excitement. And then after the marriage was finalized, Peggy and her 3 kids moved in with Pie and his 2 kids in his home in Alturas, Florida. And for a while, this newly blended family worked out perfectly, even though they were living in a fairly small house. And so all 5 of them were kind of all over each other, but they got along great. And it was kind of fun to have so many people in this house all the time. It was kind of crazy and hectic, and overall, the house just felt like it was bursting with life. But within a few months of Peggy and her kids moving in with Pie and his kids, Peggy and Pi started to have marital issues. It was like all their early chemistry had just totally vanished, and in its place was nothing. They basically completely resented each other, and everything they did upset the other person. And then, adding fuel to the fire, were rumors that began spreading around this small town where everybody knows each other, that Pi was apparently back together with an ex-girlfriend, and so he was having an affair. And so Pi, he denied these accusations, but Debbie totally believed them. And so their fights got worse and worse and worse, and the more they fought, the more a wedge was kind of driven down the center of this blended family, where Peggy's kids automatically took their mother's side, and Pi's kids automatically took their dad's side. And so from the outside looking in, it seemed plainly obvious that Pi and Peggy's marriage was not going to last. But before their marriage could fall apart, something totally unexpected happened that would link these two families together forever. In late October of 1988, so 7 months into Peggy and Pi's now very rocky marriage, Pi suddenly got up one morning and just told Peggy he was leaving for the whole day to go hunting. This was not a planned trip, he just wanted to get away. And at this point, neither of them wanted to spend any time with each other, so Peggy didn't care. She said, "Go ahead, enjoy your trip, I'll see you later." And so Pi, he leaves the house, he gets in his truck, he drives off, and then a little while later, Peggy and her daughter, Sissy, they both get their things together, and they head out and they get in Peggy's car, and they drive into town. Both Peggy and her daughter worked at the same diner as waitresses, and they both had a shift that morning. And so they arrive at the diner, they both get out, they go inside, they get their things on, and they begin their shift like normal. But not long into the shift, Peggy was about to walk up to one of her tables when she noticed her heart was racing. And she had not been running around the restaurant, she had not done any heavy lifting. There was no reason for her heart to suddenly be beating at a really fast clip. And so initially, Peggy tried to just ignore it, thinking that her heart would slow down and she would go back to normal. But when her racing heart persisted, she walked away from the table she was waiting on and snuck off into the staff bathroom, and she sat in one of the stalls, she shut the door, and she just sat on the toilet waiting for her heart to stop racing. But as she sat there, not only did her heart only continue to thump like mad, but she started to notice her legs were tingling and so were her arms. Now, Peggy was a no-nonsense person. She was not prone to panicking or overreacting or anything like that. And so as she's sitting there feeling these symptoms, it dawns on her that maybe I'm having a heart attack. And so she decides, okay, I'm going to deal with this. She stands up, she opens the stall door, she goes to the sink, she washes her hands, she washes her face, she kind of calms herself down, and then she walks out of the bathroom, she goes right into the staff break room, and she tells her daughter, I think I'm having a heart attack, but don't worry, I'm just going to go home, I'm going to lay down. If this gets worse, I will go to the hospital. But for right now, I don't really know what it is, but I want to take it seriously, so I'm going to leave for the day. And so Sissy is looking at her mom, really concerned, but Sissy knows what her mom is like. Her mom is tough as nails. She is the type of person that's going to sleep off a heart attack. And so she says to her mom, okay, go home. I'll be sure to check on you as soon as I get back, and please call me if anything changes. And so Peggy, whose heart was still racing and her arms and her legs were still tingling, she told her daughter, everything's going to be fine. And then she told her manager that she was leaving. And then Peggy slipped out the back door. She got in her car and she drove back home. When she got there, the house was empty, so she just went inside. She made her way to her bedroom and she lied down in her bed to try to get some rest. That afternoon, Peggy's son, Dwayne, came home from high school, and when he walked inside, he found his mother laying down in her bed. This was very unusual for Dwayne, because his mother never took naps. In fact, he could not recall a time ever that he saw his mom napping, even when she was sick. And so concerned, he went into her bedroom and she was facing away from him, and so he kind of jostled her awake. And when his mom rolled over to face him, her face was pale, she was sweating, she obviously had not been sleeping, she was gritting her teeth, and it looked like she was in a lot of pain or some sort of discomfort. And he said, Mom, geez, are you okay? And she would say to him, oh, no, I'm fine. I'm just sleeping something off. I got something going on. I think I have a flu or something. I don't know. I took off from work, so I'm just sleeping it off. And so Dwayne, he knows his mom is tough as nails. And if she says she's going to sleep something off, then she'll be just fine. And so Dwayne said, okay, well, let me know if you need anything. And so Dwayne began to walk away, but his mother would actually flag him back, and she would level with him, and she would tell him that actually something is wrong here. I feel like someone has poured fire down my veins in my arms and in my legs, and it is excruciatingly painful. And so Dwayne is hearing his mother say this, and he knows his mother is not the type of person to complain or exaggerate or anything. She is just straight, no nonsense. And so for her to say this is the most excruciating pain she's ever been in, and she's laying in bed unable to move, he knew this was really serious. And so Dwayne began telling his mom that you got to go to the hospital. We need to get Pi here to drive you to the hospital, or we need to call an ambulance, but something needs to be done here. But despite the pain she was in, Peggy was still a little bit reserved about it. She thought maybe she could just sleep it off. But as they're having this kind of back and forth about what to do, Pi would return from his hunting trip. He would come in the house, and right away Dwayne would run over to him. He would explain to Pi, hey, this is not normal. My mom never ever acts this way. She never complains. This is really serious. You gotta take her to the hospital. But Pi would actually say, she's fine. I'm sure she just has a fever or maybe the flu. She'll sleep it off. But when he walked into the bedroom and he saw his wife looking so horrible and literally squirming in pain, he relented and said, okay, I'll take her to the hospital. And so Pi would have to literally carry Peggy out of the house, put her in his truck. He drove her to the hospital and then had to carry her into the hospital. And by the time Peggy was under doctor's care at the hospital, she no longer could talk. She was just moaning in agony from this excruciating pain in her limbs, and her heart was still racing, and she was nauseous, and she was vomiting. I mean, she was really spiraling quickly. And so after she's been admitted, the doctors turned to Pi and to Dwayne and to Sissy and to the other family members that had assembled, and they asked them, do you have any idea what could have caused this? And they all said, no, she just suddenly started feeling this way. And so the doctors, who were unable to ask Peggy, she was in such blinding pain she couldn't even talk, they just began running her through a wide-ranging series of tests to try to figure out what was going on. But when these results began coming in, either she was negative for the thing they were testing for, or it just came back that everything was normal. And so they're looking at Peggy, seeing her completely falling apart. None of their tests have revealed anything is wrong with her. And so they're at a loss. They don't know what's wrong with her. And so without a better option, they just put Peggy into a hospital room and begin monitoring her. And sure enough, after being in the hospital for 3 days, Peggy's symptoms would come down. While she wasn't back completely to strength, she was able to speak again. She was able to eat and drink water and move around. She was still very uncomfortable. Her heart would still race periodically, and she would get fits of pain in all of her extremities. But overall, she felt like she was really improving. And so after 3 days, she was discharged from the hospital. And so Peggy and her family, they drive back to their home, and initially, everything's okay. It seems like she's on the mend. But within 24 hours, Peggy's heart starts to race again, and before long, her arms and legs feel like they are on fire. Now, Peggy and her family, they know that the doctors don't know what this condition is. And so their immediate reaction was huge concern that Peggy, again, was suffering from this horrible thing. But going to the hospital didn't really feel like the obvious first choice. In fact, the obvious first choice, at least for Peggy, was just to sit at the house and wait it out, the same way she had waited it out at the hospital. But over the next several days, despite laying in bed and resting as much as she could, her symptoms did not get any better. They got worse and worse and worse, to the point where she literally was completely bedridden, and all she could do was just shake and periodically scream into her pillow from all the pain she was experiencing in her extremities. And so finally, on October 30th, which was 10 days from the first day that Peggy felt these strange symptoms when she was at the diner, her family decided, you know what, enough is enough. She obviously is not able to just sleep off whatever this is. And so they called an ambulance, which rushed her to the hospital. And when she got there, the doctors, they remembered her from the week before. So they understood this was a bit of a mystery. But just in case, they ran the exact same battery of tests on her to see if maybe now there was some other indication of what this was. But again, all of the tests came back, and they either came back negative or inconclusive, or just showed that, nothing was wrong with her. The doctors even ran her through some tests for poison, thinking, maybe she accidentally ingested something toxic, and that's what's causing all of this. but those tests as well came back negative. And so, totally stumped, the doctors decided the only thing they could do was once again put her in a hospital room and just monitor her. And so that night, Peggy was wheeled into a room, and all night, up and down that hospital wing, people listened to the sound of Peggy screaming at the top of her lungs from the pain she was experiencing. And then the next morning, the whole situation got even worse. Not only for Peggy, who by now was dipping in and out of consciousness, but also for the rest of her family. Because that morning, Peggy's son, Dwayne, and Peggy's stepson, so Pi's son, Travis, they were both admitted to the same hospital for exhibiting the same symptoms as Peggy. Their heart was racing, they were nauseous, they were vomiting, and their arms and legs were starting to tingle. And so the doctors, with nothing else to do, just ran Dwayne and Travis through all the same tests they had put Peggy through, and they all came back negative or they came back normal. However, shortly after Dwayne and Travis had been admitted to the hospital, a neurologist who was looking after Peggy, he noticed something about her condition, and suddenly it was like his medical training from back in college kicked in, and he remembered something very specific that lined up exactly with what he was seeing in Peggy. And he suddenly realized that he knew what was going on. And so he told his colleagues, they ran out and they got this very specialized testing kit that doctors very rarely use. It's only for this one really specific and very rare condition. And they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy. And sure enough, the next day the results came back and all three tested positive for this condition that the neurologist had guessed. And even though there was a cure for this condition, for Peggy, it was too late. Her body had been so completely ravaged that even if they administered the cure, it would not work fast enough to save her life. And so that day, the doctors went to Peggy, who despite being on all these painkillers is still squirming and writhing in pain and screaming into her pillow. They would tell her, "You're gonna die. The only thing we can do is try to make you as comfortable as possible and then try to save your boys." Not long after being told this terrible news, Peggy would slip into a coma, and then 4 months later, on March 3rd, 1989, Peggy's family had to make the heart-wrenching decision to pull her off life support, and then at that point, she passed away. As for her two boys, Dwayne would remain hospitalized for 2 months and would make a full recovery. As for Travis, he would remain hospitalized for 6 months, and while he would recover, he would never walk normally again. Even though the actual medical condition that killed Peggy and nearly killed Dwayne and Travis was completely known at this point. Everybody knew what it was. What nobody could figure out was why this happened. Why in the world did this happen to these people? It made no sense. However, shortly after Peggy's death, that mystery would actually begin to unravel in the most bizarre and totally roundabout way. We've all been there. You're the host for the big summer barbecue, the guests are on their way, and you realize right at that moment as you're pulling it out of the oven that you've overcooked your zebra cornea souffle. With only minutes to spare, you leap head first out of your kitchen window, shattering the glass, cutting your body badly, and then you run into the nearby jungle and you tackle a wallaby and you knock a few teeth loose, you grab those teeth, you run back to your house, you dive You dive back into your house head first through a different window. You cut yourself up badly again. You get inside your kitchen and you whip together a wallaby teeth salad just in time as your guests are coming in the door and right before you pass out from blood loss. Crisis averted, right? Wrong. Zebra cornea souffle and wallaby teeth salad, they're not good. But what is good is HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal service that delivers actually good tasting food right to your doorstep. Between menu items like cheese stuffed burgers and grilled salmon with balsamic tomatoes, you are not only going to wow your barbecue guests, but also you're going to avoid jail time for poaching wallabies and zebras, and you're going to avoid expensive medical and repair bills from all the jumping out the windows you were doing. HelloFresh recipes include pre-portioned ingredients, which means less prep time and less wasted food. HelloFresh also offers a line of kid-friendly recipes that are perfect for families that are looking to try something new as the summer winds down and we get ready for school to start up again. So, if you're ready to stop choking down zebra corneas and wallaby teeth, then you need to sign up for HelloFresh today. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen's16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. Again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen's16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. Okay, back to the story. There is an international organization called Mensa. That's not an acronym. It's a Latin word that roughly translates to table or mind. And this organization is a highly exclusive society for the ultra intelligent. You literally have to prove that your IQ, which is an intelligence test, ranks in the top 2% out of everybody in the entire world. And even then, you may not be smart enough to get in. And in the same town that Peggy and Pi had lived, in Alturas, Florida, there was a chapter of Mensa. And the way some of these chapters worked is they would just get together every month and do some sort of intellectually stimulating activity. And in Alturas, that Mensa chapter, what they would do is they would get together at some private location once a month, and they would put on what they called a murder mystery weekend. The members of this chapter would head off to some private location like an inn or a hotel or a cabin or something, and they would all role play a murder investigation. So one or two of the Mensa members would come up with a very elaborate murder and subsequent investigation, and they would assign different fake characters to each of the real Mensa members. And so once they got there, they'd all find out what character they were and what they were responsible for. And then once they got into character, which included dressing up in costumes, they would remain in character until the killer was revealed. And so this activity was meant to be extremely intellectually challenging, but also it was extremely fun. The group loved these murder mystery weekends. And so with that in mind, just a couple of weeks after Peggy had passed away, so this is sometime in April of 1989, a new genius was accepted into the ranks of the Alturas Mensa chapter. Her name was Sherry Gwynn, and she was a middle-aged woman who had recently fled from Texas to Central Florida to get away from her abusive husband, who still lived in Texas. After she was accepted into the Mensa chapter, it became abundantly clear to the members that Sherry was eager to make friends. But not just any friends. She wanted to make friends with two very specific members of the Alturas Mensa chapter, and they were Diana Carr, who had no relationship to Pi Carr or his family, and Diana's husband, whose name was George Trapal. Diana was a very successful orthopedic surgeon who had her own practice in Alturas, Florida, and George was this computer programmer who had more advanced degrees than you could count. And, critically, Diana and George just so happened to live right next door to Peggy and Pi's house. Even though Sherry came on really strong right away to try to become friends with Diana and George, neither of them were fazed. The couple just figured, here's a woman who's living by herself. She's moved to a brand new area. She's run away from an abusive husband. It's no wonder she wants friends, and so she probably just needs some support. And so Diana and George were happy to just become her friend. The same month that Sherry was accepted into the Alturas Mensa chapter, George and Diana happened to be chosen as the people responsible for coming up with the complicated scenario that the group would act out during their murder mystery weekend that month. So George and Diana very diligently sat down and went over how to make the case as complicated as they could, and George took on the responsibility of really focusing on exactly how the victim in their fake scenario would be killed, because he was really trying to make it as difficult as he possibly could, and he was trying to find the perfect murder that would be nearly impossible to solve. And so he came up with his very elaborate murder scene, and then between him and what his wife was creating, they put together this really intense and very complicated scenario that they were both very happy about. And so a couple of days later, it was time to head out for the murder mystery weekend that George and Diana had worked so hard on. And so they went and printed off a whole bunch of those cards that would have all the information about who each of the Mensa members were going to be in this role-playing game. And there was some initial information about the murder that was committed, the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with. And so they printed all those cards out, they grabbed their costumes, they packed packed their stuff up, they hopped in the car, and they drove to the nearby inn where they met up with the rest of the Mensa members, which included Sherry. And so they get to this inn, everybody checks in, and then afterwards, they all meet up in the lobby where George and Diana hand out their cards that have the information about the role-playing game. And so everybody's reading it and figuring out what they're going to do with their character, and everyone's also looking at this so-called perfect crime that George had come up with, that he was also very proud about, and he was kind of boasting to the audience about how difficult this weekend was going to be. He really came up with the perfect crime. And so as all the members are reading their cards, Sherry would see the murder weapon used in this game, and she would become fascinated with it. And she would make a point of going over to George and asking him lots and lots of questions about how he came up with this particular choice of a murder weapon and what actually happens when this is used on a person, not just in the game, but in real life. It was like Sherry had become obsessed with this exact form of murder. She was so interested in it. And George, he was immediately aware that Sherry was kind of unnaturally interested in exactly how he had come up with the scheme. But in a way, it was kind of flattering for George because he had spent a lot of time constructing it to make it as complicated as he could. And so he indulged Sherry, and he sat there and told her everything about this particular weapon and what it does to the human body and, how you can get it and what the history of this weapon was. And the whole time, Sherry is just totally locked in. I mean, she's really focused on this particular style of murder. And so that murder mystery weekend would eventually come to an end, and all the Mensa members would think it was great, and they would head home. And then, over the course of nearly a year after that, Sherry would be a near constant in George and Diana's lives. I mean, she was always around them. She always wanted to meet up with them. She was always talking to them and asking them questions and calling. And anytime she was with them, she always wanted to be with George. And when she was with George, a lot of times she would bring up that very particular murder method that he had come up with for the murder mystery weekend. And George just continued to think this was just the greatest thing. It was so flattering that she thought he was so smart that he had come up with the perfect crime. And so anytime she wanted to talk about it, he would just indulge her because it made him feel really good. And if George and Diana had seen any red flags in Sherry with her behavior towards them, they certainly didn't show it. They basically were operating under the assumption that Sherry, no matter what, was just this helpless, harmless person who had come to Central Florida, and she was trying to be their friend, and so they should try to be her friend back. But, as they would soon find out, they were very, very wrong about Sherry. In December of 1989, so roughly 8 months after George and Diana had first met Sherry, Diana decided she wanted to move her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring. And the drive from where their house was in Alturas to where her new office was going to be was just far enough that it made sense for George and Diana to relocate to Sebring. And when Sherry discovered that the couple was moving, she immediately called George and said, "Please, let me rent out your house. I don't have a place to stay. I've been staying with friends. I'll pay whatever rent you want." And as it happened, George and Diana had actually talked about keeping the house and renting it out. And so it was actually a pretty easy decision. They trusted Sherry, and so they said, "You know what? That's fine. You can rent out the house for a couple of months, and then we'll decide if this is a long-term solution or not." And within just a couple of hours, Sherry was on Diana and George's doorstep with a sleeping bag and a small bag of toiletries ready to go inside. And so George and Diana, they grabbed the last couple of things they needed, and then as they walked out the front door, they gave their house key to Sherry and told her, hey, if you need anything, just give us a call. And then George and Diana, they climbed into their car, and as soon as they had drove off and were out of view, Sherry dropped her things and she kind of looked around, and then she ran inside of the house. And just minutes later, practically the entire Alturas Police Department came crashing through that front door after Sherry. And within an hour, the police department would find something that would not only reveal the true identity of Sherry and her true intentions, but it would also reveal the truth about what happened to Peggy and her family. A couple of days before Peggy first started feeling bad, when her heart started racing and her arms and legs began tingling at the diner, a couple of days before that, Someone had placed 8 Coca-Cola bottles, so full sodas, glass bottles, inside of Peggy and Pi's kitchen, and they set these 8 drinks kind of tucked away inside of a storage nook. A couple of days later, the family discovered these sodas, but they didn't think anything of it. They figured somebody else in the family had bought them and left them in the kitchen, and so they were fair game. And so before long, Peggy and the rest of her family were drinking these Cokes. But Peggy, who was notorious for loving Coca-Cola, drank way more than anybody else. Well, it would turn out all 8 of those Coca-Colas had been tampered with. They all contained a significant dose of the heavy metal called thallium. Thallium is odorless, it's colorless, it's tasteless, and even though there are very small trace amounts that naturally occur inside of our bodies, if there's even a little bit more than that inside of our bloodstream, it becomes lethal. And so when Peggy was admitted to the hospital the second time, around the same time that Dwayne and Travis were also admitted, that neurologist who was looking at Peggy, what he noticed about her condition was that her hair was starting to fall out. And that's when it clicked for him. He had this flashback to his medical training where he was taught about thallium poisoning. And one of the symptoms was hair loss. The other symptom was extreme pain in the extremities. And so the neurologist and his colleagues went and got a thallium test kit, and they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and they all came back positive for thallium poisoning. But the level of thallium inside of them was astronomical. The boys are lucky to have survived. They had 20,000 times the amount that naturally occurs inside of the human body. As for Peggy, she had an astounding 50,000 times the amount that naturally occurs. Way more than was lethal. And so that was why the doctors told her, there's nothing we can do. Your body is basically already dead. You're just technically still alive right now. And so the rest of the family, besides Dwayne and Travis, would also test for thallium, and they would all, with the exception of one child, have elevated levels of thallium. However, compared to Dwayne, Travis, and Peggy, of course, their conditions were negligible and they would all make full recoveries. And so the doctors realized fairly early on that this family has been poisoned, and so they contacted the police, who launched an investigation. And right away, their primary suspect was Pi. He and Peggy had been fighting extensively before she fell ill. He also had that kind of abrupt hunting trip that lined up with the day Peggy started feeling sick, and so they're thinking, okay, well, did that have something to do with how he planted the thallium? And then also there was the fact that Pi worked at the phosphate mining company, and so had access to fairly rare chemicals. However, upon closer inspection, Pi did not have access to thallium specifically. Thallium is incredibly rare and very expensive. And it just seemed odd that he would use thallium to poison and kill his wife, but he would also poison himself and his son, who he adored. It just didn't really add up. And so Pi would get ruled out as a suspect fairly quickly. But during one of his last interrogations, he would give the police something he didn't think was very valuable, but it wound up being very significant. He would say that 3 months before Peggy got sick, their family received a death threat. He opened the mail one day and there was this typed out note that said, your family needs to leave Florida in the next 2 weeks or you're all gonna die. But Pi thought it was some stupid teenage prank, and so he didn't think anything of it. And then when 2 weeks went by and they weren't dead, he just kind of forgot about it. And so after the police have ruled Pi out as a suspect, they didn't know where to turn. They had no other suspects. And so they just began focusing on who might have written this note. And that's where Sherry comes in. Sherry Gwynn was not a Texas transplant who had come to Central Florida to run away from her abusive husband. Sherry Gwynn wasn't even her real name. Her real name was Susan Gilek, and she had lived in Central Florida for most of her life. Susan was very smart, but she certainly was not Mensa-level genius smart. And so almost certainly her paperwork that got her in to the Alturas Mensa chapter was forged. Susan also had absolutely no interest in becoming real friends with Diana and George. The only reason she was pretending to be their friends and wanting to be around them all the time is because she was studying them. Because Susan was actually an undercover police officer. She had been sent undercover after the police discovered Diana and George were responsible for that death threat letter that was sent to Peggy and Pi. It would turn out Diana and George hated Peggy, Pi, and their kids. They hated them. They thought they were obnoxious. They were too noisy. They were annoying. And so Diana, who, for context, was the type of person who would stop people mid-sentence and correct them if they ever referred to her as anything other than Dr. Carr. She had gotten into at least 1 or 2 serious yelling fights with Peggy and with Pye and their kids when she had gone over to tell them to turn their music down and be quiet and do this and do that. And Peggy and Pye, they're not putting up with that. They just told her to get out of here. As for George, he didn't get into any public altercations with Peggy and Pye and their family. George was a very meek and submissive guy. He was very meager, and he was mostly a recluse. But he spent virtually all day peering out the window at Peggy and Pye and their family, studying what they were doing and obsessing over how noisy and obnoxious they were. And as he's seeing his wife getting more and more frustrated with their neighbors, George finally decides he's going to take drastic action. And so that's when George types out that death threat and he sends it across the way. But after Pye reads it, nothing happens. They don't leave Florida within 2 weeks. And so George went to phase 2 of his plan. George had actually spent time in a federal prison in the 1970s for cooking meth. And one of the byproducts of making meth is thallium. So George used his old meth cooking skills and he whipped up some thallium and he put lethal doses of thallium in 8 different Coca-Cola bottles. And then after mixing them all up so you couldn't tell there was any chemical inside of them, he used his bottle topping machine to put tops back on top of each of them. George made his own beer, and so that's why he had a topping machine at his house. And so with his 8 deadly drinks all prepared, looking like brand new Coca-Colas, George waited until Peggy and Pye and her family were out of their house. And then he snuck over and he walked into their kitchen and he placed these Coca-Colas right down on the kitchen counter and he slid them into a storage nook. And then he left the house, and that was it. And over the next several weeks, he watched with absolute pleasure as the family got sick and then Peggy died. While George never actually admitted that he had poisoned his neighbors, he did do some things that really tipped off Susan that he had to be the guy. Like, for example, that Mensa mystery murder weekend, the murder method that George had come up with was poisoning. And remember, at that point, Susan has been sent undercover to find out if George and Diana are responsible for poisoning their neighbors. And now George is sitting up there talking about the perfect crime he's come up with, and it's poisoning. And so that was why she had followed up with him really specifically on, wow, what else do you know about poisoning? And how'd you learn about poisoning? And what kind of poisons do you know about? And over the following months, even though Susan never got George to actually admit to her when she was undercover recording him that he was the poisoner, she did completely earn his trust. And she did this by always making sure she was very submissive around him and always made sure to stroke his ego and remind him how smart he was. I mean, George was used to being in a relationship with Diana, who was extremely overbearing and kind of kept him under her thumb. And so Susan kind of allowed George to feel like he was in control for once, and he loved it. And so he completely trusted Susan to the point where when he and Diana were going to move out of Alturas, they were willing to rent their house to Susan. And this is important because the house had not actually been emptied. A lot of their things were still in the house, including George's things. And so he just assumed Susan would never go through his things. But as soon as Susan was in that house and she watched George and Diana drive off, she immediately called in backup. The police swarmed the house, they searched it top to bottom, and in the garage they found George's chemistry equipment, and nestled underneath it was a bottle that contained thallium. George would be found guilty of first-degree murder as well as attempted murder on the rest of Peggy's family, and he would be sentenced to death. As of this episode, he is still alive and he is still on death row. As for his wife, Diana, who many people believe must have had something to do with the poisoning or must have at least known it was happening, was never actually charged with anything. And so she would eventually divorce George and move on with her life and remarry. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come ballroom dancing with you. But when you get out on the dance floor, just start stomping all over their feet and don't acknowledge it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, and we upload on Mondays and Thursdays. You can find that podcast on YouTube under the name MrBallen Podcast. You can also find it on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation, which makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my wife, my family, my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crime. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels called MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Español. We also post near daily content on Facebook and Snapchat. Those channels are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all platforms is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Hey, what's going on? What are we doing today? We're doing, hold on a minute. Hold on. Feel the power building. Today, we're going to cover 2 stories that are of the strange but true variety. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. Not 3, 4, 5 times a week. I know, but it's still pretty good. We're still doing it, okay? Still pretty good. So, if that's of interest to you, please install hidden cameras all around the Like Button's house, and then live stream those cameras to Facebook. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay? On the morning of June 20th, 2005, a 40-year-old man named Wang Diang stood just inside the doorway of a little home in rural northeastern China. Outside, it was pouring rain with all this crazy thunder and lightning, and also there were these hailstones coming down the size of golf balls, smashing into everything. I mean, just the impact on the roof must have been so loud. And so as Wang was standing in the doorway, he was actually looking out in the direction of the storm, because all these people were running towards him to come in the house. Wang was actually hosting a wake for a friend, and he was hosting this wake at this man's home. And all the people running up to him were all the mourners coming to pay their respects. Now, by this point, most of the mourners had already made it inside the house, and so Wang was basically just waiting for the last few stragglers to make their way inside. And so from his post at the door, Wang is watching the storm and all these people, and he also took stock of the fact that as he looked out to the big tobacco fields that kind of were all over the place in this town, that was the primary way people made money in this town, he noticed that, there was nobody out there tending the crops. And even in rainstorms, people would tend these crops because this was their livelihood, but Wang understood why nobody was out there. Yes, it was the storm, but specifically, lately there had been these crazy lightning strikes in storms like this that struck the field. And so these workers that were normally out in the fields every single day, they weren't doing that anymore. Finally, the last couple arrived, and Wang greeted them and brought them inside, and then he shut the door and then began making his rounds inside the home, making sure all the guests had what they needed, and also just kind of making sure the wake was, overall a positive experience, all things considered. Now, to be clear, Wang was not a monk or a priest or even a relative of the person who was deceased. Instead, he was just kind of like the guy that emceed virtually all events in this town. So if there was weddings, he was the guy who officiated the weddings, and if there were funerals or wakes or things of that nature, also Wang was often tapped to MC that as well. He was kind of like the village elder, if you will, even though he was only 40 years old. And Wang, he really treasured the fact that he was the guy that got to do these things, and so he put a lot of time and energy into making sure they went extremely well. So on this day, as he was making his rounds, checking in with all the mourners, nobody really needed anything. And so Wong sort of felt like he didn't have a role, and he scanned around the room looking for something else he could do that would be productive. And he noticed the incense near the casket was going out. And so Wong walked over, he pulled out the extinguished incense, he got a new stick of incense, put it in, and he lit it. And then he just kind of stood over the casket and closed his eyes and began saying a silent prayer for the dead. And as Wong did this, suddenly there was this deafening roar, and then everything went black. A few seconds later, that deafening roar faded, and it was replaced by the sound of all the mourners in the house basically screaming and trying to figure out what just happened. And so as people began kind of trying to size up the situation, they saw there was all this smoke near the casket and there was all these wooden debris everywhere. And then people looked up at the ceiling and they saw there was now a pretty good sized hole that had blackened char around the edges of the hole that was kind of smoldering. And then unfortunately, once the smoke really had kind of dissipated, Wong was laying right underneath this hole in the roof, and half of his head was gone. It was very clear he was deceased. And it didn't take long for mourners to figure out what had happened. Wong had unfortunately been struck by lightning. 2 days later, Wong's family held a funeral for Wong, and basically the entire village showed up for this funeral because remember, Wong was really a central member of this community, and so it was a really big loss that he was now dead. And candidly, this only stoked the fears that everybody had about lightning strikes. I mean, this was really becoming a huge issue. But after the funeral ended and Wong had been placed into a hearse and driven off to the crematorium to be cremated, the people at this funeral who were kind of making their way out began kind of talking a little bit more candidly about what had happened to Wong. I mean, it was obvious he was struck by lightning, but in this town, there was a lot of superstition around deaths like this, when it seems like how he died is almost like an act of God. I mean, how many people get struck by lightning? Even if you're scared of being struck by lightning, that is a very rare phenomenon, and everybody knew that. And so the mourners couldn't help but suspect that maybe Wong was not this incredible person that everybody loved. Maybe he had deep, dark secrets, and the way he was killed was like God's punishment, smiting him for the terrible things he was hiding. But nonetheless, the mourners who had just left the funeral followed tradition and actually walked over to the local crematorium where Wong would be cremated. Basically, it's the absolute final goodbye, and typically the family will stay there and wait for all the people to come by and pay their final respects. And then at that point, the family hands off their loved one in their casket to the manager of the crematorium, and the cremation process begins. And so all that happens, all the mourners go to the crematorium, they pay their final respects, and then before long, Wong's family was brought inside the crematorium with the manager, and they were placed in this quiet room to kind of wait for this process to happen. And then the manager left them and went down the hall to the furnace room where Wong's casket was waiting for him. So the furnace room inside of this crematorium is basically like this big industrial space where in the middle is this huge, intimidating metal furnace, which is actually where, the bodies are slid in and burned until they're just ash. And so picture like the biggest oven you've ever seen with a big metal rectangular door and these rails that slide directly into this furnace, and the casket is placed on those rails and then kind of fed into the furnace. They seal the door and then, of course, ignite the furnace, and then the cremation begins. And so the manager, who had done this many, many times, walked up to Wong's casket, which was already placed on the rails. Workers had already set it up for this process before he came in. And so the manager walks up to the casket, he opens it up, he sees Wong's body, and he confirms that Wong is just wearing a robe with a belt, and he did not have any jewelry or metal on him or anything like that, which was not allowed during the cremation process. And so feeling confident that this was all good, he shut the casket and then slid the casket into the furnace. He shut the door, the big metal door, locked it, and then started the furnace. And as soon as he hit it, the manager heard the familiar sound of gas hissing as the gas kind of filled up the inside of the space, and then the familiar whooshing sound of the flames igniting. But as the manager kind of stepped away from the front of this furnace and was kind of making his way back towards the door, he noticed there was another sound coming from inside of this furnace. It was a hissing sound, but different than the gas sound. This was something else. And then before long, the hissing got louder and louder and louder, And then finally, there was this massive explosion inside of this furnace. And so smoke is pouring out of the sides. It was unbelievable that the furnace itself even held its shape. I mean, something massive had detonated inside of this thing. And in fact, even though that door that seals the furnace shut, even though it had not been blown off, the force of whatever detonated inside of there was so strong that the manager actually was knocked backwards from the blast. And so in a panic, he got up, and there's smoke filling the room, and there's flames kind of dancing out of the edges of this metal door in front of the furnace, and he hits the emergency stop, and the flames cut, but it's still all smoky and it's totally chaotic, and workers are rushing into the room to figure out what's going on, and the manager had no idea. This was something he had never, ever seen before. Just minutes later, firefighters arrived and basically extinguished the remaining flames that were kind of residually burning inside of the furnace and slightly outside of the furnace. Remember, this was a significant explosion, so there are cracks and breaks all over the furnace where some flames were still lit. But finally, the firefighters did extinguish all the flames, and then after it was safe to be in there, an investigation was launched as to what the heck happened in there. And so police officers went into this room and began sifting through all the debris in this room, both inside of the furnace itself and also, outside where it had cracked and things had shot off in different directions. And for a while, they found nothing. I mean, all they found were basically pieces of Wong, ash and some bone and some tissue from him. But there was nothing else that was unusual. But at some point, one of the officers did find something that was unusual. He found a piece of metal that was inside of the furnace that clearly should not have been there. Because remember, it's not allowed to have metal or jewelry or anything on the deceased when they're brought into the furnace. And considering what happened, they're like, okay, does this have something to do with the explosion? And so the officers kind of huddled around this metal and they began kind of cleaning it off to see if there was anything written on it. It's not a very big piece of metal. And eventually they had cleaned it off enough that they realized there was something written on it, and it absolutely explained what had happened here. So to understand what happened, you need to have an understanding of how the Chinese government responds to severe storms like the one that was going on the day that Wong was struck by lightning. So remember, Wong's village had all these tobacco fields all over the place, which was not only how the villagers made their living, but also China as a whole. They need these crops to be bountiful. And these huge storms that produce those golf ball-sized pieces of hail, those can severely damage tobacco crops. And the Chinese government doesn't want that to happen. And so the Chinese government has set up these things called weather bureaus, which are these government agencies all across the country whose job is to try to weaken these storms. And the way they do that is very interesting. They use a chemical called silver iode that they put into the actual storm clouds. And what silver iode does is it attracts ice particles and water. And so with this chemical up in the clouds, it kind of breaks up the hail a little bit and either makes them really small. And sometimes this chemical can actually completely destroy the hail and convert it from hail to just plain old rain, which is great. So how do these weather bureaus and this silver iode have anything to do with what happened to Wong? Well, unfortunately for Wong, the way these weather bureaus in China actually get this silver iode up into the clouds is they basically take a rocket launcher and fire a literal rocket, like an explosive device, that contains this silver iode inside of it, and the rockets get fired up into the sky, into the clouds where they detonate, and then the silver iode is kind of sprinkled all throughout the clouds. And unfortunately, on the day Wong was killed, one of those rockets were fired into the sky, and this rocket, it goes up, 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 it goes into the cloud, but it doesn't detonate. It turns around and falls straight down, and it just so happens to go straight through that roof into Wong's head, blowing off a portion of his head. And then the rocket itself got embedded in his torso and did not detonate. And then when he was wheeled off to the crematorium and slid into the furnace, and that manager turned on the furnace, that hissing sound he began hearing right before the explosion was the sound of that rocket inside of Wong's torso heating up and then finally detonating. When the police officers found that little piece of metal, what they had found was actually a piece of the rocket itself. And when they cleared it off, they saw there was a serial number for that particular Weather Bureau rocket. And so that was how they were able to solve this mystery. 3 years after Wong's death, the Chinese government came out and said, yep, this is our fault, we did this. And so they compensated Wong's family 80,000 yuan, which is equal to about 12,000 US dollars. And while that's a pretty underwhelming settlement to be paying for somebody's life, what is significant that came out of this case is following Wong's death, The Chinese government altered their rockets that they fired into these clouds, and they added this feature where if for some reason the rocket goes into the cloud and doesn't detonate, it will automatically deploy a parachute and will safely fall to the ground and not detonate. All right, I have some bad news for you. Seagull lung is missing. You see, it all started about 4 years ago when I began feuding with the like button. Doing silly pranks like, rattling up a hornet's nest and jamming it inside the like button's toilet, or, releasing angry honey badgers into their vacation home. Just fun stuff. But lately, the like button has begun to retaliate, and it's escalating quickly. Just the other day, old Seagull received a package in the mail. He opened it up, and boom, it was a brand new lily pad. He was so excited, he hopped on it, getting ready to settle in for a nap, when he suddenly realized this was not a normal lily pad. This one was riddled in poison ivy and also strapped to the brim with fireworks and explosives. It was obviously the work of the like button. And the second Lung tried to move, it detonated, sending Lung flying across the yard. And it was at that point that something happened to Seagull Lung. He got laser vision and realized he was going to exact his revenge on the like button once and for all. And before I could stop him from going rogue, he was gone. And so unfortunately, it's now been a week and I still have not heard or seen Lung. And so naturally, I did the only thing anybody would do in this position, and that is I created a limited time merch drop. I created a brand new limited Lungy merch line commemorating our rogue comrade. Right now, you can go to shopmrballin.com and check out the entire Lungy merch line that's only available for a limited time. We have a new graphic tee and tank top. We have a new pin that everybody loved. Those sold out so fast last time. There's a sticker set. There's even coasters. I mean, if you're into Seagull Lung, which I think a lot of you are, it's pretty good, but you gotta act now because I promise you this stuff is not gonna stick around. It's gonna sell out quickly, so go get your Lungy merch before it's too late. Again, shopmrballin.com and get your Seagull Lung merch, which is your way of supporting Lung on his mission to destroy the like button. Enjoy. On January 30th, 1989, two young men were working the afternoon lunch shift at a Domino's pizza restaurant in Chamblee, Georgia. Their names were Daryl Wilson and Sean Burnset. And most weeks, this shift that they worked together was really boring because virtually nobody came into the restaurant. But on this day, at around 11 a.m., as Daryl and Sean are kind of twiddling their thumbs, waiting for the shift to end, a man who was obviously disgruntled and very agitated stormed in the door carrying a gun, a .357 Magnum gun, so a really powerful handgun, and he aimed it straight at them. Daryl and Sean were so shocked by this that at first they didn't do anything. But then it kind of dawned on them that, oh my goodness, this guy's coming in here to rob the place. And so Daryl and Sean suddenly put their hands up and they begin saying, okay, take whatever you want, take whatever you want. And the man suddenly began shouting something at them like he wanted something. And it took Daryl and Sean a second to kind of understand what he was asking for. But when they started to process the things he was saying, they kind of understood that this did not seem like a robbery. The guy was demanding that they call Tom S. Monahan so he, this guy, the guy with the gun, can talk to Tom. Now, Daryl and Sean may have known this, but probably not, because they likely didn't care. But Tom S. Monahan, at the time, was the owner of Domino's. Not like this particular restaurant in Chamblee, Georgia, but like the entire national chain. He was the actual owner of the company. And so this guy is coming in being like, let me talk to the owner of Domino's. And so at some point, Daryl and Sean understood who Tom S. Monahan was. Perhaps the guy with the gun explained it, or maybe one of them did know who Tom S. Monahan was. But either way, Daryl and Sean suddenly realized, oh my goodness, this guy wants to talk to the owner. But they have no way of getting in touch with the owner of Domino's. They're just pizza cooks. They're not like connected to the C-suite. But when Daryl and Sean told the guy like, hey, we don't know how to get in touch with the literal owner of this major franchise, well, the guy didn't like that. And he got really frantic and began yelling and screaming like, you gotta do it. You gotta get Tom on the phone. And so Daryl and Sean are like, okay. And they grab the phone and they try to call their own boss because they don't know who else to call. And as they're calling their own boss, this guy fires 2 shots into the ceiling. So this is like a really high intensity situation that's escalating really quickly. But Daryl, who actually was the one on the phone, he did his best to stay calm, and when his boss got on the other line, he tried his best to explain the situation as quickly as he could, because he could tell, this guy with the gun is very close to potentially shooting them. And the boss of Daryl and Sean did understand, okay, clearly there is a crisis happening at this branch. And when Daryl said, you gotta find a way to get Tom S. Monahan on the phone, like right now, well, his boss was like, I got it. And a few minutes later, Daryl's boss, who's still on the phone with him, was like, okay, I'm gonna patch you through. And then a second later, Tom S. Monahan hops on the phone and he's like, what's going on? And at this point, Daryl just handed the phone over to the guy with the gun and said, here you go, Tom's on the phone. And the man with the gun grabbed the phone, put it to his ear, and then began rattling off these totally bizarre demands. He wanted a white limousine to show up to the restaurant to be his getaway car. He wanted $10,000 in cash, and he wanted a copy of a science fiction novel about the Freemasons called The Widow's Son. And so Daryl and Sean, who are behind the counter witnessing this, they're hearing these demands, and it's clicking for them that clearly this guy is not mentally well. This is a guy who's totally unhinged, and who knows what's going to happen. After a few minutes on the phone, the gunman hung up and then told Daryl and Sean very calmly that now the three of them were just going to sit in this restaurant and wait for his demands to be met. And for the next 5.5 hours, that's what they did. Daryl, Sean, and the gunman, who just kept the gun aimed at Daryl and Sean, they just sat inside of this restaurant. And at the same time, by this point, the police have been called, and they're completely surrounding this restaurant. And when the gunman came into the store, because this was a very slow day, there weren't any other customers or staff inside, so it really was just Daryl, Sean, and the gunman. And so it's a total standoff. But interestingly, for Sean and Daryl, who were right there with this gunman, they started to sense that this guy was not here to hurt them. He was really after Tom S. Monahan, and over those 5.5 hours, they were just sitting there with him with his gun aimed right at them. He periodically began telling them, what his gripes were with Tom S. Monahan. The gunman told Daryl and Sean that Tom was specifically targeting him, the gunman, and also Tom was secretly communicating with the gunman when the gunman didn't want to talk to him, almost like telekinesis or something. And also the gunman told them that Tom S. Monahan periodically will walk around his property at night, kind of creeping around, scaring the gunman. And Daryl and Sean, they're hearing these things and not believing any of it, but they were very empathetic and said, oh yeah, I can understand why that would be an issue. I can understand why you'd come in here and demand to speak to Tom S. Monahan. Yep, totally get it. And that was just kind of how the day was going. And then around 4:30 p.m., so they've been in there a long time by this point, the gunman told Daryl and Sean that he was really hungry, so they better go make him some pizzas. So Daryl and Sean just got up, they went in the back, they made 2 large everything pizzas, and after they were made, they put them in boxes and slid them across the counter to the gunman. And at this moment, Daryl and Sean knew the gunman, in order to eat, would have to put his weapon down to open up the box and get the pizza. And so the second they handed it over, without even communicating with each other, they kind of waited for the gunman to put the gun down. And he did. He put the gun down, he opened the pizza up, he grabbed a slice, and at that moment, Daryl and Sean began sprinting past him towards the door, and the gunman, who's seeing this happen, he drops the pizza, he grabs the gun, and he turns, and he aims. So to really understand what's happening here, you need to understand what type of marketing Domino's, like the national franchise, was doing to advertise their product. Starting in 1985, Domino's came up with a very popular advertising campaign called The Noid. And the Noid was actually a character. It was like this weird claymation character with big sneakers and bunny ears. He was like this goofy thing that was the equivalent of McDonald's Hamburglar, but this was for pizza. And what Domino's did with the Noid is they would run these ads on TV where the Noid was like this menace who was always out to disrupt pizza deliveries. Not necessarily Domino's pizza deliveries, but generally pizza deliveries, it's like the Noid's gonna destroy them, either by, freezing the pizzas on their way to the person's house, or smashing them into the ground, or causing whatever mayhem the Noid could create to stop pizzas from getting to their customers. And so Domino's kind of catchy thing was avoid the Noid with Domino's, meaning like Domino's, the chain, was the only chain capable of avoiding all the chaos that could disrupt you getting the thing you want, your pizza. And this advertising campaign was brilliant, not only because it really worked, people really liked Domino's because it did seem like they were superior, but also they were able to kind of franchise this character itself, the Noid. It became a toy you could buy, and there was talk about doing a TV show and maybe a movie around this Noid character. And Michael Jackson, like the king of pop, he put the Noid in one of his music videos. I mean, this was a really, really successful advertising campaign, but for as successful as this campaign was, it did unfortunately lead to what happened inside of this Domino's restaurant in Chamblee, Georgia. So on the day, this gunman came charging in and held up the place, aiming the gun at Sean and Daryl. It would turn out the gunman's name was Kenneth Lamar Noyd. And Kenneth Lamar Noyd was not going into the store to get money or to steal food or to hurt, Daryl or Sean. He was there to get his revenge on Tom S. Monahan, who he looked at as the person responsible for coming up with this Noyd campaign. Because Kenneth Lamar Noyd was very mentally ill, and he believed the Avoid the Noyd campaign was not a marketing campaign, but rather Tom S. Monahan specifically targeting Kenneth Lamar Noyd, basically making him out to be this big villain. But Kenneth's plan for how to deal with this totally backfired, because in a totally ironic twist, by holding up this Domino's franchise and creating this huge standoff, he literally became like the Noyd because no pizza deliveries could be had that entire day out of that franchise. And so Kenneth Lamar Noyd, in an effort to stop Tom S. Monahan from running this Noyd campaign, because I'm no villain, I don't go after pizzas, I don't try to stop people from getting their pizzas, in an effort to do that, that is exactly what he did. He literally became the human version of the Noyd. And so after Daryl and Sean made a run for it towards the door, Kenneth did grab his gun and he did aim it at the two men, and he even fired it a couple of times, but he missed, and Daryl and Sean were totally unhurt. In fact, nobody got hurt. All that happened is Kenneth Lamar Noyd looked like the Noyd, and he got arrested. However, instead of going to jail, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. As for the actual advertising campaign itself, which was very successful, Avoid the Noyd, well, it would not survive this total PR nightmare, and Tom S. Monahan canceled it immediately after Kenneth Lamar Noyd was taken off. So in a weird way, Kenneth actually did sort of get his revenge.
Avoid the Noyd. Domino's Pizza delivers. Call now.
Hey everybody, just a reminder, we do have that new limited merch line that's all around Seagull Lung and him going rogue. There's the new graphic tee and tank top, there's the new pin, there's coasters, there's a sticker set. It's all really good stuff. Go to shopmrballin.com and get your Seagull Lung merch to help support our rogue comrade who's going out there to get his revenge on the like button. Shopmrballin.com, go get that sweet, sweet Seagull Lung merch now. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's stories, remember we have multiple podcasts under the Ballin Studios umbrella. We have Mr. Ballin Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories with hundreds of stories, many of which are not on YouTube. They're just on the podcast. We also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. We have Runful, Bedtime Stories. All you got to do is go on any podcast platform and look up Ballin Studios, and boom, you got a whole bunch of stories you can go binge. Until next time, thank you so much. See ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. Hello. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. I've got to be honest, I am completely transfixed on the chat right now. Like, there is so many more people on this live stream than every other time we've done this. So this is the... let's see, it's 2025. This is our third year doing Valentine's Day, okay? And I think last year when we did this live stream, our viewership peaked at like 6,000 viewers. What are we at right now?
7.8.
There's 7,800 people here. Little more. Love the turnout. Very cool. So, why are we here? So, a few years ago, 3 years ago, we had this idea to launch a podcast. We launched it on Valentine's Day back in 2022. And it's funny, like we totally didn't launch it, to sync it up with Valentine's Day. It just happened to be Valentine's Day when we launched the podcast. But we thought, man, what a great opportunity to play with the name, make it Valentine's Day, and have it be our community, the strange, dark, and mysterious community's, opportunity to celebrate our love for the strange, dark, and mysterious. And so here we are, 3 years later, with way more people. I can't thank you all enough, really. I mean, all joking aside, the Mr. Ballin experience, from my perspective, it started back in, end of 2019, early 2020, on TikTok. I was fresh off of trying some cringy dance moves. They weren't really taken, and I thought, why don't I tell a strange, dark, and mysterious story. Why not? And it took off. And truthfully, even when that first story took off on TikTok, even though I felt like there could be something here, something bigger, the idea that I would be sitting here, 5 years later, wow, and watching on a live stream with nearly 10,000 yet? 9,000 people? Nearly 10,000 people, with people from all over the world tuning in. I mean, I've seen, let's see, actually right now, go ahead and throw up in the chat your country's flag, and we'll just see where people are from. There's a bit of a delay on the chat, so it's going to take a second, but people from all over the world tune in every week to listen to The Strange, Dark, and Mysterious. It has taken me and my family and my team and everybody in my life to a place that I never thought possible. So on this Valentine's Day, I really do want to just say thank you all so much for making this whole thing a possibility. And when people ask me sort of what is it like to have people that tune in to the tune of millions of people, and I would say honestly, it feels weirdly, I don't know if this is the right word for it, but it feels like almost intimate in a way, in the sense that I feel like I know you all. I feel like when we talk about the community of The Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, it genuinely feels like there's real kinship there. Like there's real caring and compassion. Like, I don't know, it's a special thing we've done. On the internet, there's lots of hate, lots of trolling, and we have carved out this sizable chunk of landscape for our real estate for us that is very positive. So thank you all so much. And now I'm looking at the flags. Let's see, India, the United States. I see a radioactive sign. Nigeria, Russia. I'm seeing Sri Lanka, the Netherlands, South Africa, Australia, Brazil, Ireland. My goodness, Turkey, Great Britain. Are you guys not impressed with my ability to immediately recognize flags here? Also, pretty good. It's from playing FIFA. Which, by the way, if you play FIFA, that is a game that is tough on your soul. I just get killed by all the 12-year-olds online for FIFA, but I learned all the flags from all the players. Canada, Netherlands, it's incredible. So many people here. That's awesome. So while we wait for more people to filter in here, let's actually, before we even get into that, I also want to point out the last year. Not only am I so excited to be here and so thankful, but also this past year, like 2024, was insane. Like we launched our graphic novel that became a New York Times bestseller. We went on tour. Like we went on tour. That alone was like a huge life ambition for me, and to get to do that and to meet so many people from the community was incredible. I felt spoiled. Like doing those live shows was awesome. I even got a haircut. I mean, check this. I mean, I cut the iconic mullet. And in fact, a lot of people have been asking, and by a lot of people, I mean no one's actually asked, maybe a few people have, why I did it. Just need some change, The mullet was strong, had it for a few years, but it was getting out of control. But this year, 2025, we genuinely have some crazy stuff in store. So there's good stuff on the horizon. So hey, real quick, while we get ready for more people to come in here, it's only 5 minutes into the stream. We want to make sure people have a chance to join. Let's transition to some Q&A from our Discord members. They submitted some questions, and also while we wait, go ahead if you want to fire some questions off in the chat. I'll answer some questions in the chat as well. So, all right, here we go. Here's some questions from our Discord community. Okay, that's our core place online where we have an opportunity to exchange messages and everyone can talk to each other on our Discord community. All right, first question is from Lost in Tarnation. On your live tour, what was your favorite venue to do your show? Man, honestly, they were pretty sweet. Some of the Chicago theater, if I'm being honest, that was the biggest venue we did. It was just so massive when we were there. It just sort of felt like fake life to be standing on a stage with just like, thousands of people there. That was pretty cool. It's also a very iconic venue. I would also say Nashville. I think it was called the Polk Theater in Nashville. That was pretty good. Also, by the way, I should have said this at the top. We are going to be doing a giveaway at the very end of this live stream. So if there's any reason to stick around, that's it. You got to stick around to the end for the giveaway. And then also, I do have a story I'm going to tell you here very shortly. It's a good one. It's a story that's not been published anywhere on any of our channels. It's a new story, so you want to stick around for that. Again, as we wait for more people to come in. All right, next question. Again, from our Discord members. This one is from Palm and Love. Do you prefer to tell unsolved stories or solved? And which one do you prefer to hear? I definitely prefer to tell solved stories only because it allows for sort of a more concrete ending. It's tough to sort of, map out a whole story and have it be like, and nobody knows. That's not literally how it goes, but I prefer solved from the perspective of sort of like tying up loose ends. Like you have like the actual answer. In terms of what I prefer to listen to, actually, kind of ironically, I like listening to unsolved because it allows me to sort of wonder about the world mysteries. I'm gonna look in the chat real quick. Anonymous, you look like an old friend. I'm gonna take that as a compliment. Thank you. From Lenans, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Good question. I don't know. I mean, obviously, crushing the strange, dark, and mysterious. Honestly, if I'm being candid, I think one of the things that I love doing the most is actually stuff like this, like live stuff. I think I like the fact that you get one take. I like the pressure of, all right, you're on. Whether or not it goes well is sort of secondary. I kind of enjoy the pressure and opportunity to sort of perform stories and do things live. I think that's part of the reason the live tour was so much fun is it felt like, all right, you can either totally screw up or do a great job. And I liked that. I liked that feeling. And also I'd say secondarily, I loved just getting to get real audience feedback. I mean, I'll tell you, it's very different right now knowing that how many people we got, Drew?
11,000.
There's 11,000 people here. Okay, so putting this in perspective, I think the biggest show we did was like 3,000 people, and that was in Chicago during the live tour, and that felt like an unbelievable number of people, like an ungodly number of people. And there's 11,000 people here, but I'm looking at a camera, and I got Drew and Antonio in the background who are not really looking at me, so there's not much real-time feedback happening. So it's very different, but still, I like the live stuff. So if I was to circle back, I would say I think more live stuff in 5 years. People are asking how to get Discord access. What's the best way to describe how to get Discord access?
On our website.
If you want to join the Discord, if you haven't already, go to our website, ballenstudios.com, and you can. I'm sure there's it's pretty easy to figure it out. Yeah, you can find it very easily. It's not a gimmick. It's not a scam. You just sign up. Boom, you're in Discord. It'll give you the full run of what we have to offer at Ballen Studios. Okay, next question. This is from Crew. Where can I listen to your podcast? I feel like I'm missing out. Well, I mean, after all, Valentine's Day in many ways is about the celebration of the podcast launching, Mr. Ballen Podcast. That podcast is available on all podcast platforms. However, if you want to listen to the podcast on Amazon Music or Wondery Plus, you can listen early and ad-free. But across the board on all the other platforms, you can listen to the Mr. Ballen Podcast. Shout out to our wonderful partners over at Amazon Music and Wondery. It's been an incredible partnership with them over the past few years. I mean, a lot of the growth and the new opportunities you're seeing coming out of Ballen Studios are a direct product of not just the partnership, with Amazon Music, but really like the direct collaboration with their many groups of people in their teams. It's been incredible. Okay, I know you guys are getting antsy here. I've blown away the first 10 minutes of just rambling, but I'm pretty confident. I'm pretty confident that we're close to being at a peak number of people here. So maybe it's time to get into the news story here. The reason that a lot of you guys are here is to listen to the story. So yeah, I have a story I'm gonna tell you right now. Again, this story has not been told on any channel. It's not been published. This is the first rendition. It's pretty good. It's a classic. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you come to the right place. I'm forgetting my own intro. Then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button, a nice fresh batch of cotton candy, and when they take it, slap it into a puddle. You know what's funny? I do that intro arguably 20 times a week, if not more. And it's so autopilot, I forgot it. That's pretty good. That's a new thing for me. There you go. But here we go. Here's the story. Here we go. On June 7th, 2008, A middle-aged woman named Kim Spengler was working at this family paint shop. She worked there. She'd been there for several years, and she was stocking shelves, going about her day, when one of her colleagues came up to her and tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Hey, Kim, we think your car alarm's going off. There's an alarm going off in the parking lot, and we think it's your car." And Kim immediately, when she heard this, she became totally like panicked. She thanked the colleague and said, okay. And then Kim, she went to the counter where she had stashed her purse, and she grabbed her keys out of her purse, her car keys, and she put the keys into her fists like brass knuckles. She put the key kind of pointing up out of her hand. And so she's kind of holding her keys like a weapon. And she makes her way towards the door. This is in North Carolina, suburban North Carolina. It was in the middle of the summer, super hot. And she's got these keys in her hand. And she steps outside into the blazing heat, and she can hear the alarm going off. And she looks and she can see it's her car. It's definitely going off. But for Kim, it's like she wasn't really focused on the car. She's sort of anxiously looking around the parking lot, looking for any sudden movement. She's looking if anybody's coming up to her. I mean, she's totally on edge. And the reason for this is because recently Kim had left a very toxic relationship with her boyfriend, a guy named Ricky Simmons, who was 49 years old. Ricky and Kim had connected 5 years earlier when Kim was going through a really dark time in her life. She was struggling with substance abuse. She was just at a low point, and Ricky also was sort of at a low point too in his life. He also was struggling with substance abuse. He had just gotten out of jail. He had served time for manslaughter, in fact. And Kim, I think that she basically looked at him as being sort of like a troubled soul, but somebody that, still had a heart of gold in there somewhere. Like there was a kinship there. There was a relatability. And so that was 5 years ago from this point in the parking lot with the car alarm. However, a few months earlier, Kim had gotten the strength and become sober. And when she became sober, Ricky didn't like it. Ricky was sort of not an advocate of hers at all. And so they ended up breaking up. And it was a very rocky breakup. And, Kim at first thought that Ricky would sort of just get over it, but Ricky began effectively stalking Kim. He began showing up at her apartment unannounced. This is a few months earlier. It got to the point where Kim actually filed a restraining order against Ricky because he was becoming so sort of unhinged. He was so unhappy about what had happened, about the breakup. And on top of that, there was something else that really was sitting in the back of Kim's mind, which was, Ricky wasn't just this unhappy boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. He also was the primary suspect in the disappearance of his son's fiance. So Ricky's son, he had a 22-year-old son, and his son had a fiance. Her name was Jamie Fraley. And around the same time that Kim broke up with Ricky, Ricky not only became sort of obsessed with Kim and became her stalker, but he also sort of began a lot of the same behaviors with Jamie, again, his son's fiance. And about a month after Kim and Ricky had broken up, Jamie went missing. And Ricky was the primary suspect in her disappearance. And he was actively being investigated for her disappearance. And so, from Kim's perspective, she knows that Ricky is, he's an ex-con. He served time for manslaughter. He knows that he's being investigated for this disappearance. And so she's constantly on edge here. Like, despite her restraining order, she does not feel like that's actually going to keep Ricky out of her life. She's very scared of him. And so when her alarm went off, her first thought is, it's got to be Ricky. Maybe he's broken into my car. Maybe he's setting a trap for me, whatever it is. And so as she goes outside, that's what's going through her head. Anyhow, so she gets out in the parking lot. It's blazing hot. She's got her keys in her hand, and she's looking around, but she doesn't see Ricky. Big open parking lot, bunch of cars. She sees her car. And so she clicks her key fob and turns off the alarm because it is her car that's going off. And she walks through the parking lot and she gets to her car. She kind of is careful as she's walking up to it, making sure nobody's hiding, But when she gets to her car, she sees there's no damage. The car is undamaged. All the windows are rolled up. There's certainly no sign that anybody broke into her car. And so Kim is thinking, okay, clearly what's happened here is, somebody must have just bumped into it. Like, this has nothing to do with Ricky. This is just, I'm on edge, given what's happening in my life. And so again, she's turned off the car alarm. She checks her car, again, just to make sure, Ricky's not here, and he's not. There's nothing going on with her car. And she ends up going back into the paint shop. And so she goes back in the paint shop and she finishes up her shift. And by the time her shift ends, which was only a few hours later, she hadn't forgotten about the car alarm thing, because Ricky and sort of the torment he was causing in her life was really front of mind for her. And so when she left the paint shop now to go home, she had calmed down, but like, she's walking through the parking lot, going back to her car, like just again on edge. She's got her keys, poking out of her hand like as a weapon. But she gets to her car and there's nobody there. She immediately hops inside, shuts the door, locks it, turns it on, blasts the AC. And it's like she can relax. Like, okay, she's safe in her car. But as she's sitting there, she sort of took stock of the fact that her car was kind of a mess. Now, normally Kim was a very organized and clean person. she was very tidy. But really over the past few months that she'd been dealing with this saga, which was the Ricky saga, she had sort of, kind of fallen off on regular duties, like keeping her car clean, that type of thing. But she knew that the next day, which was Sunday, she was going to be going to church early in the morning, and she had volunteered to drive some of her church friends to church. And so she's thinking as she's sitting in the car, exhausted from the day, like, oh, okay, the car is kind of smelly, and there's trash, and there's clothes, and there's this. She said, I got to clean out my car when I get home, because I don't want to, roll up to my friends tomorrow for church and have this car be smelly and gross. And so she tells herself, as soon as I get home, I'm going to clean my car. And for what it's worth, she typically did do that. Most nights, she would clean her car out, take out the clothes, whatever. But, after her drive, finally ended and she got home, she just, she was checked out. And she's like, you know what? I know I need to take out my dirty clothes and take out the trash and clean up, but I just don't have it in me. So I'll just get up early tomorrow, I'll clean up my car, and then I'll, go about my day. So she gets out of her car, she goes into her apartment, and she goes to bed. The next morning rolls around, and she gets up, except she sleeps through her alarm. She's late. And when she looks at the clock, she realizes she does not have enough time to clean her car. She doesn't really have any time at all. She basically needs to run out of the house, get in her car, and drive and pick up her friends. Otherwise, she's going to be late. I mean, she's already late. And so she sprints out of the car, she sprints out of her house, gets in her car, and like right away, she's like, oh my goodness, like it's so messy, it smells bad. And she starts driving and she's like, taking trash and jamming it into the different compartments, doing her best to kind of make it look a little bit more presentable. She rolled the windows down to get some fresh air. But, she ended up picking up her friends for church. And, as soon as they get in, they're very polite. No one's going to call Kim out. They sort of know she's going through a rough time, but it was pretty obvious. They were kind of grossed out by the condition of her car. And, Kim's like very apologetic, like, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry it smells. I'm sorry it's dirty. I should have taken care of this. Next time I will. And they're like, oh, don't worry about it. And so they end up going to church. And after church, Kim went off on her own and sort of spent the day running errands. And around 6 p.m., she ends up coming back to her house. She's done for the day. And so she pulls into her parking lot, or she pulls into her parking space, and immediately she's like, okay, I need to clean my car. Like, this is a full day overdue here. I got to clean my car. And so she starts cleaning her car. She pulls a trash can over. She takes the trash out of the main cabin of the car. She takes out, work stuff and papers. And then once the interior of the car had been straightened up, she went around to the trunk, because in the trunk was her dirty clothes. And so Kim, she goes to the trunk, she opens it up, flips it open, and she freezes when she sees what's in her trunk. So to understand what she found in the trunk, we have to go back 24 hours. So 24 hours earlier, this is back on Saturday, Kim, her car alarm was going off. And it turns out, her car alarm was going off. So it turns out she was right to suspect that potentially Ricky could have been involved with her car alarm. And I'll explain why. Every Saturday for forever, Kim had a very particular routine. Every Saturday, she would go to the gym in the morning. She would change out of her clothes and she would put her gym clothes in the trunk, put on her work clothes. She'd go to work. And then in the evening, she would get home and take those dirty clothes out and clean them. That was her routine. And it was as much of a routine, or I should say, it was such a routine that like Ricky was aware of that routine. And so on Saturday, when she's at work, when the car alarm went off, it was Ricky. Ricky had broken into her car. Ricky knew that at the end of the day, she's going to open up that trunk to take her dirty clothes from the gym and bring them inside and do the laundry. But unfortunately for Ricky, Kim didn't do that, right? So Ricky, he breaks into her car and he climbs into her trunk. And in hand is a knife. He's holding a knife. And he closes the trunk on himself, knowing again, based on her routine, that she's going to open that up at the end of the night and he can spring out and attack her. But because of Kim's torment from Ricky and how scatterbrained she was, she didn't empty her trunk that night. And so for 24 hours, Ricky stayed in the trunk with that knife. And he eventually cooked to death. And so when she opened it up, he was dead and decomposing in the trunk, still clutching that knife. So in addition to that, unfortunately, Jamie Fraley, so Ricky's son's fiance, her body was never found. She was never found. And police still suspect that Ricky had murdered her, but we don't know what happened to her. But what almost certainly happened is simply because Kim did not open the trunk that night, she saved her own life. So that is a nice, uplifting Valentine's Day love story to brighten everyone's mood. And also, I will say that while you're reacting to the story here, I failed to say, guys, there is a special guest that is here that I can't believe I didn't think to include at the top of this show. But now, in some ways, this is even better. Now we're in this thing together. How many people we got in the show right now?
13-4.
13-4. Okay. We have a special guest. Okay, and it is none other. Don't worry, this is age appropriate. Old Seagull Lung. Okay? We got Seagull Lung merch. Right? Here he is. He's back. Okay? And wouldn't you know it, we have this brand new Valentine's Day merch that has just gone live. So, let's see what we got with this exclusive drop. So we have the shirt that I'm wearing. Old Seagull Lung. You want to throw the video on here so I can see, so I don't give a horrible... There we go. The old Seagull Lung right here, holding it down. I think, by the way, this is a sweet shirt. You can zoom in. You got the little clever... it unfocuses. But you have little hearts, like, you know, in school, you have the hearts, the Valentine hearts, the different stuff. But it's all strange, dark, and mysterious related, okay? You got that. You got the classic Valentine's Day hoodie. Every year, we knock these out, okay? Very cool. Got a nice graphic on the back. If you want to check this stuff out, I'm doing a horrible job holding this up. You just go to shop.MrBallen.com. This stuff is available right now. Also, I've always said my favorite shirt, besides this one, of course, are the annual Valentine's Day shirts. Just the plain old Valentine's Day shirts. Okay, there's the one. I'm probably gonna rock this thing. Actually, honestly, I think the Seagull Lung shirt might be my top choice now. We didn't have that last time. Got that. We got the crew neck as well, in honor of Crew, who's in here with us. You guys remember the tall guy from Tor? The tall and handsome devil, Crew Doyle, our Discord manager. That's why we did the crew neck, Crew. Just for you. And of course, check it out. We got these pins, the numbered pins. Let me hold it back so it focuses. Get old Seagull Lung here. Each one's numbered. These are collector's items. These are sweet. People love these things. You got pins, and we got stickers. Okay, boom. So again, you just go to shopmrballen.com and you can get this stuff. This exclusive Valentine's Day merch. Again, check this bad boy out. This is sweet. Who would have thought that a competition for who could think of the worst pet name, Seagull Lung, me and my siblings had this competition years and years ago, would amount to this wonderful character, Seagull Lung. So there you go. Okay, so we have like 14,000 people here. So let's do this. Let's Let's transition to some more questions here while you're getting psyched for merchandise. Also, if you want to give your reactions to the story in the chat, I'm sure people have already done that. Okay, but let's do some questions. This is here we go. Are these from Discord?
There's a few more from Discord.
There's a few more from Discord. Okay, this is from Wobbles. This is a good question. What was your plan if YouTube didn't work out? You know, I don't know. I've sort of had a weird career trajectory that's sort of marked by making impulsive gambles, if you will. Not really, but I went, to college, and I met my college sweetheart, Amanda, would die if she knew I was talking about her here, but that's okay. Met Amanda, but then after college, I had told my family I was thinking about law school. I wasn't. It was just a thing I would say, and I just wanted to like have the thing that I could tell people I was doing, so nobody would ask me. But really, I wanted to join the military, and I did. And I joined the military, and I tried out for the SEAL teams, and I became a Navy SEAL, and that was crazy. And then when I got out of the military in 2017, I kind of didn't really know what I was going to do. And in truth, from 2017 to like 2019, I did some philanthropy, some consulting. I was sort of all over the map. I don't know if people know this, but the transition from the military to the civilian world can be pretty difficult. You sort of have like this total identity, which is the military side of you. And then when you become a civilian, you don't lose it, but like that aspect of your life is so utterly divorced, in your civilian life, that it's tough sometimes to make the jump. But, naturally, as I was struggling to figure out my place, I was like, well, why don't I post cringy sketch comedy videos and dance videos to a predominantly kids-centric app called TikTok and see where that takes me? And luckily that took me to a place where I was posting strange, dark, mysterious videos on there, and then it worked out on YouTube. But, honestly, I don't know what I'd be doing. I think if anything, I'd be teaching. I know I've given a horrible answer here. I think that if you know one thing about me is I like to ramble and talk, and I feel like a good opportunity to do that is being a teacher, except it's like you can help people learn at the same time that you ramble. So I would say teacher. I actually at one point thought I might be a philosophy professor. I studied philosophy in college. I used to love those thought experiments. I've done this on other live streams. So my favorite thought experiment, so in philosophy, if you study philosophy at any level, there's these things called thought experiments where your professor or whoever will say, okay, I'm going to present you this sort of theoretical, situation. And the whole point is you sort of have to pick a side of whatever it is that they're talking about. And like each side feels equally appealing. But if you choose this sort of side, there's like obvious arguments on this side to negate it and vice versa. And so one of those thought experiments was talking about the scope and size of the universe, of everything that exists, right? Sorry, getting carried away here. And so the idea is like, okay, so the universe, which is really the catch-all way of saying everything that exists, everything everywhere that exists, is either infinite, goes on indefinitely, or finite, that it has some ending somewhere. And even though that's sort of a simplistic way to look at it, that's sort of what you start with. You say, okay, so the universe is either finite or infinite. And it's like, okay, well, let's dig into that. Okay, pretend you have this bow and arrow, okay? I didn't come up with this. This is totally regurgitated. You got this bow and arrow, okay? And if you fire this arrow in any direction, it will travel infinitely in any direction. It will pass through anything. There's nothing that can slow it down. It'll travel at an infinite speed in an infinite direction. The only thing that can stop this arrow is the end of existence, meaning where things come to an end, so to speak, that it will just keep on going, right? And so the class, and I'm thinking back to when I did this in school, the class is like, you had to answer the question before the professor got into it, which is like, what do you think will happen? Do you think the arrow will go on forever, suggesting that the universe is infinite? Or do you think the arrow at some point, even if it's an ungodly distance away, will at some point stop being able to go any further because there's nothing else that exists beyond it. It effectively hits a wall. Do you think the arrow will go on forever, or do you think it will come to a stop somewhere? And so the class is very divided, because each one sort of represents a compelling argument. But each one has a very unique problem. If you say, okay, the universe is ungodly massive, but it is finite. It has to be. At some point somewhere, it's got to end. Well, if you believe that, and you believe the arrow effectively hits a wall, so to speak, in every direction, at some point it's going to hit this outer bubble of existence. As a human being, the way we understand things, we cannot conceptualize of what's on the other side of the wall. Because it's nothingness. In this example, it would be nothingness. Nothingness is on the other side of that theoretical wall. But when we think nothingness, we often go to, okay, we think blank. Well, that's something. Blankness is something. Okay, it's darkness. Well, darkness is something. Oh, it's a void. A void is something. It's a vacuum. You get the idea. We cannot, in our own human experience, conceptualize of nothingness. And so it forces us to say, okay, well, it can't be nothing because nothing doesn't exist. It must go on forever. The arrow must travel forever. But the implication of infinity is in order for anything to be infinite, things don't exist in a vacuum. Like this sweatshirt, this in courtesy of crew neck, it is affected by its environment. It is a different sweatshirt based on the fact that I am holding it right now. So I affect this crew neck. And so for there to be an infinite number of these crew necks, there would need to be an infinite number of variations to the crew neck itself, and every person in the world would have to hold up each variation an infinite number of times, because infinity is all possibilities exhausted infinitely. And so it implies string theory, which is if the arrow goes on forever, there are an infinite number of worlds, Earths, people, me and you, that are repeated infinitely with an infinite number of variations. So either it's finite, the arrow stops, and then you suggest there's nothingness on the other side of the wall, but we can't properly conceptualize of nothingness. Or you say, okay, well, it's infinite, but then you have to say, okay, well, then there's an infinite number of yous out there, like me right now, giving this similar talk, but maybe I'm wearing the crew neck instead of the ball and the seagull lung hoodie, t-shirt, if you will. And there's another universe where I did the intro correctly. You see what I'm saying? So it's crazy. Anyhow, I don't know if people like that stuff, but that's where my head goes. So I think I'd be a teacher or a rambler. This arrow hit me right in the keister by Dolphin Bear. There you go. Let's get some questions from the chat here. Directly from the chat. I'm looking at the chat right now. Come to Alaska, John. I spent some time in Alaska. I spent some time in Kodiak for a month. Very cool. Huge bears. Didn't see any, but at the airport they had a, what's it called? What's it when they stuff dead animals?
Mummified.
What is it called?
Taxidermy.
Taxidermy. Speaking of taxidermy, you guys ever see those bad taxidermy? It's like some of the funniest. If you have not seen this, I'm going to give you something to Google. Look up bad taxidermy, where people take. It's sad. I'm sorry for the animals that passed away, but there are these ridiculous images of people that have taxidermied, dead animals, and they just don't look right. Like there's like lions that are taxidermied, but like their eyes are like in weird positions. There's some stuff on TikTok that's really funny. So bad taxidermy. I don't know how we got there. What is your favorite color? From Ashley Cotilla. Green. Gonna go with green. My eyes are green, and that's always made me favor green. So there you go. Let's see. I got one. What's a story you'd like to tell, but it's too short? Great question. I see, who just scrolled and stop. I want to make sure I see that person. I'm sorry, I didn't see your username. I have a story that I didn't prepare for this that's incredibly short, and I'll throw it out there. I did put it on YouTube. This is like just ad hoc. So during World War I, and you're going to have to forgive me because this is off the cuff. I don't remember all the details, but I know this story is a real thing. During World War I, there was a British soldier, and I forget their name, but they were in the trench. They were in a trench. This is like ruthless, trench warfare with the Germans. And, this particular soldier, this British soldier, was a veteran. and had survived many waves of attacks. Like they've been beaten down. Like they are veteran trench warfare, a warfare soldier. And it's dark out. The shooting had sort of lulled at this point, and there's all this mist out over the expanse between the trenches. If you don't, I don't mean to insult people's intelligence at all here, but trench warfare is like literally there are trenches dug on opposite sides. Each enemy or each military unit is in the respective trenches, and they just like shoot at each other, and they lob grenades and bombs and poisonous gas. I mean, it's like some of the most brutal fighting that can exist in it's not even modern warfare, but it's in warfare. And periodically there'd be these lulls in fighting. And this British soldier on one of those lulls, it's the evening, and he's on watch. He's staring out across this dark expanse. He knows the Germans are literally like 100 yards away from them in their trench, but everyone's just kind of hunkered down like on their guns. And at some point, the British soldier hears someone walking in no man's land, which is the land between the trenches, where basically you're going to die if you go in the middle. Like you don't go in the middle. And this German soldier was sort of like stumbling their way through the mist between the two trenches. And the British soldier looks up, and he's got his gun trained at a known enemy combatant. But he makes eye contact with this German soldier, this young German soldier. And the British soldier would recall thinking how defeated the German soldier was. He looked like he'd been wounded potentially. He didn't seem like a threat. And the German sort of suddenly realized, oh my gosh, like I'm in no man's land. I'm about to get killed. And there's this long pause where the British soldier is staring at the German soldier. And there's a decision that was made where the British soldier just lowered their gun, like a show of mercy. I'm not going to kill you. You go on your way. And the German soldier sort of nodded to the British soldier and then walked back towards the other trench and disappeared into the mist. It would turn out that German soldier was Adolf Hitler. So that could have changed history in a pretty big way. That's the story goes anyways. But who knows how true that story really is. But supposedly that is true. Sort of already touched on that one. Let's see here. And I know there's a 17-second delay. Will you ever come to Colorado? Maybe. What's your favorite breed of dog? I have a dog now. I've always been a cat person. I have a dog now, Maggie. She's great. I will say she's been going in the house quite a bit. It's been stressful. Kind of a mess. We're getting over it. She's learning. She's a sweetie. She's 4.5. We picked her up from a shelter. Right around Christmas. She was from Alabama. I think she was in a kill shelter, and there's an exchange program where I live where they pulled dogs from these kill shelters, and we got Maggie. So Maggie's great, but she is a super mutt. That is her breed, which I think just means she's a mix of like all sorts of dogs. I think she was a stray, so I guess that's my favorite because she's great. I love Maggie. All right, let's see more questions here. I'm a cat person. I love doggos too. Yeah, I'm sort of both now. I've always been a cat person. Let's see. Would you like to come to South Africa? From Jean Francis Crawford. Would you like to come to South Africa? Yeah, I mean, I think there's a pretty big contingent of strange, dark, and mysterious fans in South Africa. I feel like that's consistently an area where we see people being very excited about the content being from there. Let's see here. Have your kids ever told you any ghost stories? What's your favorite scary story? Jamie Slatton, what's your favorite scary story? Jamie Slatton, what's your favorite scary story? What's funny is the story that like really unsettled me more than any other, oddly enough, and maybe it was because I was a certain age when I saw this, but it was the movie Signs with Mel Gibson, and specifically the scene where the Thing walks past the alleyway, the birthday scene, when Joaquin Phoenix is in the closet and he's like, "Get out of the way, children, get out of the way," and he's looking at the camera. You know what I'm talking about. That's the scene in the movie Signs. That was pretty unsettling. I'd say that's up there for sure. And then what was another one that really startled me? I'd say Signs, though. Signs was a big one. Let's see. Scary. Oh, here we go. Stephen Lahart. Scariest experience of your life that you are willing to share. Well, you know what? Why not? I'll tell the scariest experience of my life. I'll tell the time I almost died. Why not? We have enough time. So for those who don't know, I actually, before I do that, Drew, are we good if I go into a rambly story for 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So before I became Mr. Ballen, before I ever posted any content, I was in the Navy. I was a SEAL. And for those who don't know what that is, it's the special operation. It's one of the special operations communities within the U.S. Navy. And I was only in for a short amount of time. I joined in 2010, got out in 2017. And in that time, I deployed a total of 2 times. One of those times was a non-combat deployment, and one was the first one. And so that was in 2013 and 2014. Myself, along with our platoon, our troop, were deployed to Afghanistan. And it's interesting when you go through all the training to become a Navy SEAL or any other just direct combat unit, because that's effectively what the SEAL teams are. Whenever you deploy, whenever you are trained for combat, let's say, it isn't that you literally want to go and like harm other people, which is what combat is. That's what warfare is. But there's a part of you that's like you're trained to do it, and there's an aspect of wanting to sort of be put to the test. I know that that's not a feeling that I had on my own. That's one that a lot of people had. And I remember when we were told that our platoon was going to be sent to Afghanistan. This is in 2013. Candidly, it felt like we had sort of won the lottery, if you will. I had a very different perspective on the conflict overseas. I had a very different perspective on combat. I had never been a part of it, but I felt like this is a time to sort of go do the thing that I've been trained to do. And so we get overseas to Afghanistan, and for the first 5 months of the 6 months that we were there, in many ways the deployment was sort of what I expected it to be. There were plenty of lulls where nothing really happened. We'd go out on missions and nothing would happen for sure. In fact, that made up a lot of the time we were there. But there also were definitely times where we went out and we did get in contact with our enemy, and it was gunfights, the thing that we trained for. And on Easter of 2013, we were in this town, this very urban town called Zarganshar. Basically, it was one of the most northern towns, and town is a bad description. It's like a mini city, if you will, that was just south of Kabul. So the capital, I think that's the capital. It's the biggest city in Afghanistan. And, we were going in there because a lot of times there were, suicide bombers, and there were other people that would be staged in that town, and then they would make their way up to Kabul, where they would, be utilized. And it was our job at times to go in there and try to stop that. And so on that day, when we went into Zarganshar, which is an area we'd been in several times before, it was definitely, we were used to going in there and used to getting shot at when we were in there. We ended up getting sort of ambushed. I think that's probably a stretch to call it an ambush, but it's a very tight, like double-decker homes. Like it's like a mini city. It's tight alleyways. I mean, it's a tough spot to get shot at. There's lots of blind spots, and we sort of put ourselves in a position. And when I say we, I'm talking about a group of like 12 to 15 of us, along with our partner force as well. So 12 to 15 Americans, along with, might have been 20, along with 20 or 30 partner force, so Afghanis that are working with us. And we went into Zarganshar, and we sort of unintentionally put ourselves effectively right outside of this courtyard, where we came to realize there were combatants up in the second floor that could see us, but they weren't shooting at us. They just saw us. And we knew this just through our technology. And we also knew that they were basically waiting. They knew we were in a spot where if we went forward, as we were intending to do, they had a vantage point on us. They could shoot us as soon as they wanted to. And if we went in reverse, if we tried to retreat at this point, our backs would be exposed. And due to the rules of engagement, which is effectively what you can and can't do overseas based on the Geneva Convention, which, NATO forces adhere to, we couldn't preemptively do anything to them unless they attacked us first, and they didn't. And so a decision was made by our leadership on the ground. We knew the situation we were in. It's sort of like go forward and get into a contact and fight our way out of it, or retreat and get shot at. And our decision was, go forward. And so we make this decision. It's broad daylight, by the way. And we definitely briefed all the people in our battle space that this was going to happen. We're anticipating this contact. And it's on video. I remember, we walked into this courtyard and it was so eerie. I'm walking in a patrol, with an automatic machine gun with me, and we're walking in a staggered patrol, and we get like halfway through this very like walled in courtyard, and machine guns opened up on us. We returned fire. We couldn't really even see where they were coming from. And right away our dog got shot. Two of the partner force that we were with also got shot. Fortunately, and I say this is going to sound callous, but it's not intended to. Fortunately, none of the SEALs got shot, and I only say that because we were more well trained, and the more of us that could fight and do anything, the better it was for everybody. So all the SEALs took up fighting positions, and for the next several hours, it was like this awful sort of sporadic gunfighting back and forth between us, and we were not in one group. We kept breaking off into fire teams and small groups of 2, 3, 4, and but we were up against a group of people who really had our number. I mean, they were well positioned. They kept hiding. There were tunnels that we knew about that were dug underneath the city for them to quickly egress out of. And it was sort of like I think it was about 6 hours from that initial volley of fire until later that night, where it was like constant, but not literally constant gunfire, but a sort of steady stream of sporadic gunfire, feeling like they have the drop on us. Where are they? And we never really saw anybody. Like they just kept shooting us and we couldn't see anybody. And so it was sort of disheartening, to say the least. But I remember, this is what the story turns into my most scary moment of my life. It was nighttime and the fighting had sort of stopped. Like that sporadic gunfire had stopped. And at this point there was a drone overhead that was watching the entire area, and they spotted a group of, they're called MAMs, so military age men, and it's speculative. They don't know. They're too far away to actually know anything about these people on the ground, but they spotted who they believed were a group of military age males hiding out near one of the exits of the city. Now, again, sort of due to rules of engagement, there's no way they could actually positively identify that they had weapons or not, or what their intent was. But given what had happened that day, our overhead, our drone operator is basically saying to us, like, hey, be advised, we think there's this group of MAMs that might be setting up to hit you on the way out, because that looks like the direction we're going to go out. Maybe they're waiting for us, right? And so it just so happened that myself and my fire team, I wasn't in charge of it. I'm a very junior new guy. I'm just literally along for the ride. But me and the fire team I was a part of, the 7 of us, I think there were 7 of us, we were just physically closest to those military age males, just based on our position in the city. And so a decision came down to not go engage them, but simply go and see if you can see who these people are. Like sneak over there under the cover of darkness, figure it out and look and see what those people are doing. See if they're a threat to us, because we are going to have to go that way out. We don't want to get ambushed. And so we maneuvered through the city, like honestly, like you'd imagine in a video game, like maneuvering down alleyways. It's the middle of the night. It's eerily quiet because all day there's been shooting here. And so everybody's gone, and anybody that's in the city at this point effectively is a combatant on either side. And so like any movement sort of represents a threat. And we ended up going down this alleyway. And we, based on what we were hearing from the drone and what we knew of the city, we knew we'd go down this alleyway that would come to a T intersection. We're in this walled in alleyway, and we'd come to like the head of the T where there was another wall. And we believed that we'd be able to look over that wall and we'd be looking across this field. And our expectation is that these mams that we're going to go look at would be in this field, but on the other side of the field. Not where we are, but over there. And that we'd have a vantage point from this wall. We could go to the head of the T, look over the wall, and scope it out. The problem was we snuck down this alleyway really effectively. We got to the T intersection. And when we did, we're on night vision, it's totally pitch black, it's silent. We're about to look over the wall when we hear talking. And it's talking coming from the other side of the wall. It's Pashtun, it's people from Afghanistan that are speaking. And one of the team members poked his head over the wall, and he quickly identified, hey, this is spoken, and not even a whisper, it was so quiet, it was like guns. Like the realization was, for whatever reason, we're wrong. We have now snuck up on the mams who are armed, and they're on the immediate other side of this wall. And now we have this unfortunate situation where we haven't alerted them yet. They don't hear us. It's obvious they don't know we're here. There's 7 of us. There was a group of them, and we are separated by a thin mud wall that's maybe 7 feet tall. And basically, to get into it, one side heard the other, and before long, we are in an all-out gunfight, literally shooting over the wall. They're shooting at us. But critically, at least 2 of them, were holding grenades with the pins pulled on the grenades. And the whole idea was if they got compromised, these were fighters, they'd take out their killer with them. And so as soon as the shooting began, they threw grenades over the wall. And I remember I was not one of the guys up over the wall. I was sort of right behind in support. And I remember watching this grenade come over the wall, and time slowed down. It really did. We were on night vision. We had this drone overhead that was casting down this infrared spotlight, and the spotlight was flashing. I forget the reasoning behind it, but it's like, imagine like God has a flashlight and God is shining the flashlight straight down to earth. Like it's crystal clear. You can only see this light under night vision. But because we were in that cone of light, it was sort of blinding, and it was a flashing light, like a strobe. And so it was sort of like the light would come down and I would see for a second, and then it would come off and you kind of lose your vision for a second. It was a strobe. And so I remember seeing this grenade come over the wall, and it would be like lit up by the IR strobe, and it would be here, and then the strobe would go away, and then the grenade would disappear. And this is all in like the fraction of a second, but my brain is processing that a grenade is about to come over it's coming over the wall. And this grenade, it comes over and it hits my shoulder, my right shoulder. And I remember thinking, again, time is slowed down. I've never had anything like this in my life. I remember thinking, okay, the grenade's about to detonate. It's going to kill me. That's what's going to happen. I'm about to die. I just hope that it doesn't blow my head off, because then I can't have an open casket funeral. And so the grenade comes over. That's what I'm thinking. It hits my shoulder and it begins falling towards the ground. And I remember as the grenade reached maybe my halfway point next to my torso, again, in a fraction of a second, I'm thinking, phew, I'm still going to die, but now it's going to blow up and just, hurt my midsection, but my face will be intact. I can have an open casket. My family can see me. The grenade kept falling and it landed next to me. And at that point, I'm thinking, I might only lose my legs. It's like, holy cow, I'm going to survive this. And then the grenade, it detonated. It actually felt like someone took a handful of rocks and just like threw it at my back. My conception of what happened next is not actually what happened. I thought that I was like fully lucid and sort of like was able to crawl sort of to cover, and somebody else dragged me out at that point. But in reality, I actually was pretty much immediately incapacitated. And in fact, of the 7 of us that were down there, I think 6 were immediately incapacitated. The one guy who wasn't was our medic. He was a SEAL as well. And he described going into flow. He's getting shot at from a foot away, but he literally began pulling guys out. And then as guys who were also hurt began coming to and returning fire, they began pulling the other guys out. And so I ended up getting pulled out. I'm bleeding to death. I remember sitting in this alleyway, sort of waiting to die, being hyper aware that I was bleeding to death. I couldn't pull my tourniquets off my kit. Your tourniquets stop your bleeding. They were fastened by rubber bands to my chest. The whole point is for quick release. And I was too weak. I couldn't do it. And I remember I thought about the fact that I hadn't started a family yet and that I wasn't going to have kids. That hurt. I remember thinking also very practically, I was like, I wonder in my obituary if it will say, Jonathan Allen killed in action or John Allen killed in action. Like that's going through my head. But my medic ended up finding me in time to put tourniquets on me. And then under a hail of gunfire, my other wounded teammates literally carried me nearly a mile out of the place where we just were in that alleyway to where we had a hot extract with a helicopter. And at this point, I had no sense of whether or not I was going to survive. I thought I was, like, high on adrenaline at this point. And we get to this field hospital. We get flown, me and the other guy who was hurt really badly. We get to this field hospital. And basically, there's like a triage center before you get shipped off to like higher care. And by this point, so all the SEALs in country sort of communicate with each other. There's a system that we would use to communicate with each other. And we all have what are called battle roster numbers, and they're sort of unique to each person in country. And my and one of my teammates' roster numbers, I think mine was like Fox 008 or something, forget what it was, got passed across this communication system. And the way it was passed was effectively we have 2 SEALs, it's cryptic, but who potentially could die. And they're being brought to this field hospital. And this field hospital was on a base where other SEALs were. And so me and this other guy, we get pulled off the helicopter and we're wheeled on gurneys into this, imagine like a all brightly lit up room with all these doctors, literally. It's doctors and nurses with white outfits on, gloves on, ready to perform whatever emergency surgery that needs to be done. They have no idea what our status is. But all the SEALs, it's the middle of the night. They think one or two of their brothers are potentially dead or about to die. And when I got wheeled into that room, it's a small tent, I looked over and I saw all these SEALs were in the tent, and they had these very somber looks on their faces, and they had put on their best camis. You don't have nice camis in country. You just don't have them. Like, they took the time to basically put on their best outfits and were standing in the tent to basically be with us. It makes me emotional thinking about it. In case we died. And yeah, thank you. But we didn't. But I remember when I was given, sorry, I've told this story a lot, and it's surprising it's hitting me right now. But when I was given ketamine to go under for surgery, I had no idea like how bad this was, because all I see is what's happening in front of me, and I don't know if I'm going to survive this. I thought I was good, and then like the sort of the reality of the moment was so huge. But then I woke up in Germany, and I survived. But that was it. That was the scariest moment, and it's honestly the part of the reason I'm emotional is not even like the fear of dying, because I can actually tell you that as I was laying in that alleyway, sort of expecting to die, I actually wasn't scared. I didn't really feel any pain. I was like filled with a lot of regret. And I think now, just thinking about my family and what I wouldn't have had, you know. I gotta pull it together. Anyways, I'm so grateful now to have Amanda and to have my these damn allergies, Melissa Rossler, exactly. I'm so grateful to have my wife and kids, you know, and they're a miracle to me. When I got out, that's what I got. I think about what a blessing it is to have been saved. You know, it's like my teammates are responsible for me being alive today. I would have bled to death without them. And the idea that turned into such a beautiful family is just it's incredible. So this wasn't planned. So be grateful for your loved ones on this Valentine's Day. Celebrate your loved ones. And here, before we wrap here, I want to make sure, Drew, there's nothing else that we've missed. I do want to, this is a good time to plug merch. What do you think? Speaking of my emotional near-death experience, let's talk about merchandise. Actually, the giveaway. Let's make sure we cover the giveaway. So again, so we have merch. Go to shopmrballen.com. Also for the giveaway, which I mentioned we're doing, you sign up by going you sign up for the giveaway by going to our website ballenstudios.com. The link is in the description. Again, it's ballenstudios.com. All you have to do is sign up for our newsletter. That's it. You're entered that way. And you should be on the lookout to see if you won some free merch. Okay, sick free merch. Again, thank you all for being here. This was a weird moment for me. I'm very surprised that I sort of got emotional there. I wasn't expecting that, but you know what? If there was a day to do it, I feel like it's Valentine's Day, a day for love, a day for family. Okay, so thanks for coming out. Let's see, anything else I'm missing before? I'm scatterbrained here again. Oh, I have one last surprise for you. Okay. But I gotta make sure I understand it. These are only people that have signed up for the newsletter. Okay, because that makes no sense otherwise. You got to sign up for the newsletter. Okay, forget the giveaway is one thing, but also the special thing is if you sign up for that newsletter right after this, like right now, you will receive a special thing in your inbox right now. But you got to sign up for the newsletter. That's not just the giveaway. That's if you want this special thing. Okay, so yeah, ballenstudios.com. If you want to sign up for the newsletter, go to shopmrballen.com if you want merch. I love you guys so much. This was something else. Thank you. Happy Valentine's Day. Until next time, see ya.